Chapter 1. The Life of Izuku Midoriya. People are not born equal. In this society, you are either born with power, or you don't have any. Those with the right quirks are praised. People believe in them. Those with none are considered worthless, near subhumans. It's a fate feared by every 4-year-old until their quirk appears. Kids are fools. In this society, there is something that can be even worse than being born quirkless. Both fates cannot be changed. At least that is what most think. The classroom was filled with happy chatting. As happy as you could be in the beginning of a new school day. That changed as soon as the first person turned to look at who had just arrived. "Watch out," the student said. All chatter ended right away. Everyone's eyes followed young Izuku Midoriya as he walked across the classroom. None of the looks were friendly, but one specific pair of eyes had fire in them. Explosions, really. Izuku turned toward the front of the class before approaching Katsuki Bakugo, whose blonde hair looked like it had been blown up by his personality. Izuku quickly got to his desk at the front corner of the class, right next to the windows, and took his seat. The desks around his had all been pulled away from him to create open space around him on all sides, just enough to be out of arm's reach. Even the teachers rarely got any closer than that, even if Izuku needed their help. At least people weren't constantly mocking and actively beating him like before. Ever since his hair had lost its green, it had become like a lighthouse warning other students to stay away. He was alone, but at least he didn't need to look over his shoulder every few seconds. Sometimes he didn't know which was better. Another lesson passed uneventfully as Izuku focused on studying. Most of his classmates had already left as he got his stuff back into his backpack, and he let the rest file out rather than pushing through the crowd. He was mostly successful. Thinking the path was clear, he walked out of the classroom briskly to make it to his next class. Of course, he bumped against the last person he wanted to. Bakugo only needed a glimpse of Izuku to jump away and bring his hand up, small explosions sparking on his palm. "What are you trying to do, thief?" Bakugo screamed at Izuku. "I didn't try anything. I'm just going to the next class." Izuku answered with a tired voice and a blank expression. "Yes, sure. Need to study hard to get to the best villain school? Oh wait, those don't exist. You'd be better off just dropping out. It's not like you'd end up on the streets with that rich dad of yours." Bakugo pointed at Izuku's expensive wristwatch. Izuku brought his other hand protectively over the watch. "At least the rest of us wouldn't need to deal with your shit." Bakugo turned and left. Some nearby students stared at Izuku. Someone snickered. No one came within an arm's reach of Izuku, who was staring at the floor and glanced at his hands and his watch. With a sigh, he continued walking to the next class, trying to leave everyone else as much space as he could. Of course, that took time, and he'd probably be the last one at class again. "Is something wrong, young Midoriya?" Hearing the first friendly words of the day since leaving home, Izuku looked up at his geography teacher. "Just the usual, Kuro-sensei," Izuku answered. "I ran into Bakugo after the last lesson." "I see," the teacher said. The young man was the only one in the school that actually treated Izuku well, including the staff. He could even get angry at how Izuku was treated. Even now, trails of dark mist leaked from behind his ears and across his face like it often did when they talked. Sensei, your quirk," Izuku pointed out. "Thank you for noting that." The teacher controlled his quirk, making the mist disappear, and gestured Izuku to enter ahead of him. Inside, the students nearest to his desk had already moved theirs further away, but Kuro-sensei would have none of that. "Put your desks back where they are supposed to be. This mess is disrespectful and makes my classroom look disorganized." The students knew there was no point complaining, so they did as told, but they were not happy about it. Izuku wasn't sure if Kuro-sensei's support in this did more harm than good to him, but he appreciated the teacher's gesture nevertheless. It was the only class where people would not make nasty remarks at Izuku and get away with it. After the lesson, he stayed put even after every other student left the room. "Young Midoriya, you shouldn't allow their prejudice and fear to affect your self-worth. They're only acting like this because society has taught them to, as unfortunate as it is." "That doesn't help much since I still need to live in this society," Izuku responded and got up. "I didn't fit what it expects people to be when I was quirkless, and my quirk just made things worse. Sorry, I shouldn't burden you with my problems." "You shouldn't worry about that, Midoriya. Helping with your problems is my job here. That includes you making it to the next class in time, so I must ask you to go now. Thank you, Izuku said as he left the room. It was his last conversation for the school day, and eventually that too was over. Izuku walked out of the school gate and headed home. He never took the direct route home, a habit from when Bakugo and others might ambush him to get some entertainment out of the quirkless kid. Now it gave him some peace to think either alone or surrounded by people that didn't know or avoid him. He pulled out his quirk analysis notebook. Even if he wouldn't be accepted as a hero, even if society hated him for his quirks were still too interesting for him to not analyze them and the people that used them, heroes especially. He began mumbling and writing as he walked. Izuku put his notebook away after writing down his most recent thoughts and looked around. He had come further away than he thought, and the area didn't look very good. He got his bearings and headed straight home. His route went through a bit of a shady underpass. Izuku stopped to check it out before going through. He was almost at the end of the tunnel when he heard steps behind him. Glancing back, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, had entered the tunnel. He was alone, and it was a public street, but Izuku got a bad feeling about the man. His eyes were too focused on Izuku, so he started walking faster. He was almost out of the tunnel. He figured he could make it. A van drove into his line of sight and stopped suddenly, just a few meters in front of Izuku, blocking the tunnel exit. He turned away just as the side door of the van opened, but before he could run, the man that had followed him rushed at him. The man collided with Izuku and pushed him back as two pairs of hands grabbed him from behind. He was still processing what had happened when the group pulled him into the van. As the door started closing, something clicked inside Izuku, and he started fighting back with a new fervor. The two men behind him were still holding onto his arms, so he started kicking towards the face of the man that had pushed him while screaming his lungs out. "Shut up, little fucker," the man in front of him said as the door snapped shut and the van began moving. He grabbed Izuku's legs, but Izuku kept wiggling and fighting and hit the man in the face. The next moment, a torching heat glowed against his face. The man had let go of one of his legs and flames burst from the back of the man's hand like a flaming sword that moved towards Izuku's neck. The flames filled his vision. He could still move his hand below his elbow, and in desperation, he reached up to grab the arm wielding the flaming blade. There was no way he could stop the man if he wanted to kill him. There was only one way he could at least try to fight back. It was just hard to remember how to do it while being kidnapped. As his hand grabbed the attacking man's arm, Izuku drew a deep breath. Everyone stopped. Izuku didn't struggle physically, too focused on using his quirk, and the trio attacking him just held him. "What the?" The man Izuku grabbed shouted and pulled his arm free. What's happening to my quirk?" With one man off him, Izuku started struggling again, trying to twist his hand to grab another. "Don't let him touch you." A hold on one of Izuku's arms loosened and a hand was placed on the back of his head. His entire world shook and an immense pain struck his head. His vision blurred, and a fraction of a second later, everything went black. The first sensation telling Izuku that he was still alive was a squeezing pain around his wrists from having his hands tied up in front of him, and a similar pressure around his legs. He was laying on the floor in a corner of some room. His vision was still blurry, but he could make out moving outlines in the well-lit room, and his ears worked just fine. "At least we got someone worth ransoming this time. Look at this watch. Better than the last time. So much time for nothing." Maybe it would not have been for nothing if you didn't get impatient and turn her insides to jelly. "You better hope that this one actually wakes up so we can get his parents' number. He's fine. I can control my quirk when I want to." "Damn it," a third person shouted. Izuku recognized it as the man with the fire quirk. "Still nothing?" another man asked. "No, I can't use it at all. Whatever that brat did, it's like my quirk is gone. I can't feel anything. We aren't ransoming him anywhere until he fixes this, and if he doesn't, the fucker will wish you had turned his brain to jelly." Izuku's vision was getting a little better, so he saw the group of men turn and notice his wakefulness. All of them had covered their heads with ski masks. "See, I told you I didn't shake him too hard." The man had not even finished speaking when the freshly quirkless kidnapper ran to Izuku and dragged him up from the collar of his shirt. He punched Izuku on the face. making his vision go fuzzier again for a moment. Izuku stared at the man, dazed. What did you do to my quirk? Izuku didn't immediately answer, so the man punched him again. Izuku gasped and let out a cry of pain. So you can still make some noise, good. Now what did you do to my quirk? Izuku paused to cough and gag. It was a miracle he hadn't already emptied his stomach on the floor, which seemed to be spinning now. He stayed up only because he was held so by his attacker. Destroyed it. It's my quirk. Quirk, deletion. Izuku fumbled out the half-truth. He received another punch, this time to the stomach. His stomach finally giving up, his vomit burst up his throat. The newly quirkless man let go and jumped away from him. Izuku fell down hard and kept vomiting on the floor. His still seething attacker stomped away to the other end of the room, leaving Izuku next to the puddle of what had a few hours ago been his lunch. A door somewhere nearby creaked open, and there was a repetitive knock against the door. Izuku turned his head to see the new arrival, some old man. So, what is going on here? You having trouble with a kid? That isn't just any kid. The brat destroyed my quirk. What do you mean destroyed? That isn't possible. Well, he did it, grandfather. That brat grabbed my arm when we captured him, and then I couldn't use my quirk at all, like it was just gone. Izuku, now no longer vomiting, pushed himself away from the stinky puddle and rolled a bit so his face wasn't pressed against the floor. The old man seemed to look at him. You said your quirk is gone or was destroyed. How do you know that? There could be many reasons why you can't use it. The brat said so, and I know about erasure quirks. Those shouldn't have worked when he was unconscious. There. The old man paused, staring at Izuku. Was he scared? There is another type of quirk that could cause that. Your generation might not be familiar with it, but any villain of my age, has at least heard the stories of a man with the quirk to take quirks. The old man walked closer to Izuku with the group of younger villains in tow. Izuku could only lay there and watch them approaching. The old man met his gaze. Tell me the truth. Is your quirk to destroy quirks? He paused. Or to steal them? Izuku blinked. How did he know? The old man held his chin. This could be bad. Behind the group, a spiral of darkness suddenly appeared and extended to cover most of the wall. Izuku could only stare and wonder why the dark mist seemed so familiar. A few seconds later, the old villain and his thugs turned around to face the mist just as two people stepped through it. One of them was completely covered in the same black mist, only his clothes visible outside of it. The other was dressed in a regular black suit, but his entire head was covered by a black helmet with a lower part that covered his entire neck with a thick metal collar. Chapter 2. Rescue and Reunion. The two strange men wordlessly stepped in front of the group of criminals as the misty portal disappeared behind them. Get them! One of the younger criminals shouted. A bunch of them charged at the new arrivals, but never got close. A dark cloud burst out of the man covered in it, almost as if his very body consisted of mist. In seconds, half of the room was completely filled with darkness that covered the attacking men. A few yelps of surprise and fear were the last signs of the men that had attacked the new duo. As the mist retracted, there was nothing left of them, not even bloodstains. Considering how the duo arrived, it had to be some kind of transportation quirk. The two remaining villains backed closer to Izuku as the misty man approached. Kurogiri, the masked man said. They are mine. Yes, master. The misty man stepped aside, but even then his yellow glowing eyes seemed to focus on Izuku from behind the mist. The man he called master walked closer. The old man standing above Izuku started shaking. Could it be, he said. All for one. So you know me, the masked man said and chuckled. The sound made Izuku shiver. It wasn't a happy chuckle. The sound promised pain. Yes, master, the old man said. I used to lead one of your enforcer teams in Tokyo until All Might destroyed our operation. Then you disappeared. I thought you were dead. Many do, the masked man, all for one, answered. The old man lowered himself to his knee. I may not have known of your survival, but I have never forgotten your great gift you gave me. I am at your command if you accept my service again. I might have considered that. Your age provides you experience many of my allies lack. However, the masked man looked downwards at Izuku. You know too much, and your men attacked my son. Izuku stared at the man, too dizzy and confused to think straight. It took a while before he even understood what word the man had said. The smell of his own vomit was mixed with a new stench as the old man soiled his pants. Hey, you really know this guy? The younger man said. He sounded like the one that had talked about shaking Izuku. The man called all for one raised his hand, his palm toward the old man, and a second later a spray of blood rained over Izuku. He felt like vomiting again as the iron scent entered his nose, but he was pulled up as two arms snaked under his armpits and pressed their palms against his chest. Don't get any closer, or the kid gets it. My vibration quirk can turn his insides into mush before you can stop me. Izuku, realizing the danger, started struggling against the man's hold. Let me go, he cried out and raised his tied-up arms, trying to hit his attacker's head behind him. He didn't manage it as the man blocked his hands with one of his own. Even in the haze from all his injuries, Izuku was still thinking analytically enough to see the man's mistake. He managed to grab the arm blocking his strike. The man remembered who he was dealing with. When he realized his mistake, it was already too late. Izuku felt a small shock against his chest, but as the man's quirk left him, there was no longer enough power to cause any serious damage.
No, no.
The man shouted. Something yanked him back. His arms let go of Izuku, but not before they pulled Izuku to fall on his back. He hit his head and before blacking out again barely saw tendrils of black mist flowing around the freshly quirkless man, like dark fingers of death pulling him into a cloud of black as the man's face twisted in horror. The blunt force trauma he suffered is not an issue even without quirk-based treatment, someone said in the darkness. He sounded familiar. The real damage was caused by a quirk, most likely the same one that he took. Creating strong vibrations inside the skull could be the cause of this damage. Is it permanent? Asked a voice that sounded like the man called all for one. It could have been, but if you are willing to use your quirks, it is not beyond our capabilities to ensure a rapid and complete recovery. He will still need several treatments over a few weeks. I don't have anything against that though. He is the second person ever to manifest the all for one after all. You can do what you want of the men Kurogyri sent as long as they never get to talk to anyone again, but Izuku is not for you to experiment on. It would be a nuisance if I had to find people to replace you after all this time. Someone stepped next to Izuku and touched his forehead. A green glow filled his vision even through his closed eyelids. As soon as it began, Izuku's pulsing headache eased up a bit, and he sighed in relief. You're awake, the man said. The hand left Izuku's forehead as he opened his eyes. It was the man with a black helmet, except the top of the helmet was gone, revealing. Izuku didn't know if he could even call it a face. The man's bald head was completely scarred, and where his eyes should have been was covered with skin. There wasn't much else to see since his nose and mouth were covered by some kind of breathing mask attached to the lower part of the helmet around his neck. Izuku didn't dare to move, and just stared at the faceless man that had killed a man in front of his eyes. The fact the old man had been the criminal behind his kidnapping didn't erase the blood that had hung around Izuku like fine iron mist. Still, something in the man, his voice felt familiar. Izuku's eyes sprung wide open as he remembered what the man had called him earlier. That voice. Now that it wasn't as distorted by the helmet, a little kid inside Izuku recognized that voice even after all the years. It couldn't be. Without even thinking, the word escaped his lips.
Dad?
Yes, Izuku. It can't be, Izuku said. This had to be some scheme. The man claiming to be his father put his hand in his jacket and pulled out a single photograph. He held it for a moment and handed it to Izuku, who recognized his mother in the picture instantly, and also himself as a little kid, and then there was a white-haired man. This was his family. Izuku looked at the faceless man. This was his family too. If that is not enough evidence, we also seem to have the same quirk. Your hair even went white like mine when your all for one manifested. As he spoke, the man raised his hand to Izuku, showing a small hole in the middle of his palm. Izuku looked at his own hand, which too had had a similar hole since his quirk appeared. The man put his hand back on Izuku's head, and the green glow returned. All for one. It is the true name of our quirk, and the name people know me with. I just called it quirk transfer, Izuku muttered. So, you really are my dad. And are you a villain? Depends on what do you consider a villain. You're trying to avoid my question. A villain is a villain, Izuku said. I could say the same to you. Villain is a villain? That sounds like something your classmates might say to you. That someone is a villain because they say he is a villain. It is the same with society. If those in charge, if the majority of people would judge you for your quirk or quirklessness and say you are a villain, he paused. Are you? I know you've been called one. Izuku stared at him as the words sunk in, bringing up memories of all the times people had called him a villain. How do you know? Was all he could say. I've stayed away from you and Inko for obvious reasons, he gestured at his missing face, to keep you two separate from my business, but I still kept an eye on you in case something happened. How do you think I knew that you had been kidnapped? Kurogiri, come here. The black mist-covered man walked into Izuku's vision. The mist around his head twisted and split, briefly revealing a bit of a human face. Kuro-sensei? Izuku said. Yes, his father answered. He is one of the people that have been keeping an eye on you and Inko for me. Luckily you wore the watch I sent you. It has a tracker in it. Kurogiri handed Izuku his fancy wristwatch and phone that his kidnappers had taken. Izuku quickly grabbed the watch and held it tightly in front of his teary eyes. I didn't have many things from you, Izuku said. I wanted to hang on to at least that one thing. It felt like someone was there even all the times I was alone. This wasn't what I expected. I did not think it would be, All for One said. To answer your previous question, I am considered a villain of the highest degree. I have sought to change society in many ways over a very long time. With the power of my quirk, it was easy to gain support, but that comes with increased opposition. People can worship or fear power depending on how they perceive it. I don't need to tell you how people view our power. In the end, those who would oppose me were able to dictate how the society would work with the help of people with powerful and flashy quirks that people saw as heroic. Anyone who opposed them, anyone who even used the quirks they were born with without their permission, was declared a villain. Even anyone associated with a person considered a villain would be ostracized. Often just having been born with the wrong quirk is enough for that. That is a large part of why I left you even before my injuries. You killed that old man, Izuku accused. The one whose gang kidnapped and very nearly gave you permanent brain damage? Yes, I did, and he was the lucky one among them. Kurogiri did not give the rest of them the mercy of a quick death. They did not deserve one, Kurogiri said. Only now Izuku noticed that his teacher's mist was flowing around him on the bed. Izuku didn't want to ask what they meant, but the misty gesture felt strangely comforting, and whatever healing quirk his father was using on him really eased the pain in his head. You do not need to accept everything I have done, All for One said. You may know about me now, but you are also old enough to decide if you still want to have nothing to do with me. After you have properly recovered, we will need to see a few times for your treatments. I can also help you understand your quirk better. No one else in this world can, so you should consider it carefully. Izuku looked at his hand again. He shouldn't have kept talking with this man. Father or not, he admitted to being a villain and had just killed someone, but Izuku couldn't really deny what the man had said. He felt similarly in many things whether he said it aloud or not. There was also Kuro-sensei, or Kurogiri. I don't know much about it. I accidentally took Bakugo's quirk. I haven't used my quirk since I figured how to give Bakugo his back. I didn't want to steal anyone's quirk. Until today, All for One said. You took a quirk from the man that threatened your life. How do you feel about that? I don't know, and I actually took the quirks from 2 of them. 2 in one day, All for One muttered. I would ask how you feel, but with your other injuries there's no point. What do you mean? This is one of the things you need me to teach you. Usually, humans only have a single quirk, and for most that is all their body can take. They might survive having a second quirk, but there could be side effects depending on the quirks. A few people can have dual quirks, or just bodies that are naturally more adaptable. Our quirk itself allows us to amass a large number, and our bodies adapt to them, but that will take time. You have gained 2 new quirks in a single day with no previous training or experience. You may feel some side effects until your body adjusts. Izuku brushed his chin. If everything going on wasn't so overwhelming, he would have already descended into unending analysis and muttering. That makes sense, I guess. I've never actually thought about that. I didn't think I would ever take anyone's quirk again. It is what your classmates and society would expect from you. To deny and suppress your abilities for no other reason than that they don't like it. I often feel like that, but they aren't totally wrong. Stealing people's quirks isn't exactly the right thing to do. I sure hope you aren't stupid enough to believe that after today. If you had some flashy super strength quirk, you could have punched them to defend yourself. How would that be any better than using your all for one to take their quirks? If you wanted to not injure or kill them, that would be even better than many quirks that are considered heroic. All for One took his hand off Izuku, and the green glow disappeared. That is all I can do today. You should try to sit up. All for One stepped further from the bed to give Izuku more space as he sat up. Cables hanging from his head hit his arms and back. The pulsing headache had returned as soon as his father had stopped using his quirk, but the rest of his pains were gone, and for the first time Izuku looked around the room. It was dimly lit mostly by a single light by Izuku's bed and a computer screen on the other side of the room. Both were surrounded by medical equipment of all kinds. The room was better equipped than most intensive care units. Besides him, his father and Kurogiri, there was one person in the room mostly hidden behind some medical machinery. Don't mind the doctor, All for One said. He doesn't yet wish to show his face to you. Just know you can thank him for treating both of us. Izuku looked towards the hidden man. Thank you. I feel a lot better. Nervous and polite as ever I see, the man responded. Did he too know Izuku? He sounded familiar. If you can walk straight, you're free to go for today, as far as I am concerned. Izuku breathed in deep once and got on his feet. Luckily there was no dizziness, just the headache. He looked up at his father's missing face. So what now? You will need to come back a couple of times to complete your treatment. After that, as I said, you're old enough to decide. You can continue your life as it is, and I will be working abroad as before. All for One paused. Or if you want to stay in touch and keep training your quirk, we can do that, but there are risks and coming back home is no longer an option for me either way. I'm not sure. You don't need to decide today, except on one thing. One thing. Your mother. Izuku's eyes went wide. How late was it? His mother had to be worried sick. She figured out I was a villain, but does not know even the amount you now know. She has always said you work abroad, Izuku said. That is the excuse I gave. I don't think she ever truly believed it. She won't be happy about us meeting like this, even less for your kidnapping and injury. I am not going to lie to her, Izuku said without hesitation. He looked down at his blood-stained clothes and was grateful he had already emptied his stomach. Not that I could. Very well. I trust you try to keep her quiet about this. Your life will only become harder if people hear you are the son of someone society considers a villain. Holding back Kurogiri might be difficult if that happens. Izuku glanced at the misty figure. Is he going to stay at my school? Yes, and he will bring you here anytime you want. You already saw his quirk. Some kind of teleportation.
Warp gate, Kurogiri corrected.
Are you going to send me home with it? Yes, when you are ready. Izuku looked at his father. I will talk with Mom. I have to think about this and I can't decide based on just one side of the story. All for One's cheeks tensed around his breathing mask as if he was smiling. At least she managed to raise an intelligent child. Talk with Kurogiri tomorrow. He will bring you to continue the treatment after school. Izuku nodded, and now a familiar misty warp gate formed next to Kurogiri. Izuku looked at it for a moment, resisting the urge to ask more questions and analyze the quirk. Instead, he stepped through without another word. A swirling darkness surrounded him for a moment until the world got less dark and buildings materialized around him. He was standing right next to his house. Looking at the nice two-story building, he couldn't help thinking that it was his father, this villain called All for One, that had made sure they could live so comfortably, sending money that he supposedly earned working abroad. Years earlier, finding out that Izuku had a bigger house had irritated Bakugo to no end. Izuku walked straight through the yard, his mother's pride, and opened the door. Yes, he heard his mom talking. My friend whose son goes to the same school confirmed that he left school normally, but that was hours ago. No, he usually takes a walk after school, but he never goes anywhere for long without letting me. Izuku stepped into the living room where his teary-eyed mother was talking on the phone. She raised her head. Izuku. Chapter 3. Mom and Dad. Izuku. The phone fell on the large sofa as Inko Midoriya jumped up and ran to her son with the speed of an Olympic sprinter. She stopped in front of Izuku like she had been hit by a paralyzing quirk. Her eyes widened at the sight of blood droplets all around his clothes and the lingering stink of vomit. Tears started to flow from her eyes, probably enough that it could have washed away the blood. Blood. Izuku, are you okay? What happened? Does it hurt anywhere? I'm going to call help. She spoke so fast her sentences started blurring together, but the last part was completely clear. Izuku's eyes widened and turned towards the sofa where the phone still waited, probably in the middle of a call to the police. He grabbed his mother's arm just in time before she got out of reach and back to the phone. He pulled her close. He whispered, afraid the phone might pick up sounds from afar. You can't talk to the police or anyone. Izuku, what is going on? She asked, thankfully more quietly than before. I saw Dad. His mother's eyes widened and glazed over for a moment. After recovering, she looked at his blood-stained clothes again. Not either of ours. He saved me. I will explain everything, but... Izuku glanced at the sofa. We don't want to talk to police right now. I think. Please, Mom. She stared at his eyes and slowly nodded. Her steps were shaky as she walked to the sofa. Hello. Yes, I'm still here.
Saw thee.
He just came back home. I may have overreacted. He's my everything. No, he doesn't. Apparently his father showed up suddenly and wanted to talk to him. No, I can take care of my own family matters. Yes, I will call if something bad happens. I'm sorry for taking your time. She put down the phone and collapsed on the sofa. Mom. Izuku rushed to her side. He took her hand in his and put the other on her shoulder. He breathed a little easier seeing she was still conscious, just shocked by everything that had happened. Mom, breathe. It took her a few seconds to calm down and sit upright on the sofa. She tapped the spot next to her. You should sit. If we are going to talk about your father, it will take time. Izuku moved to do as she asked, but remembered his tainted clothes. He took off his school uniform shirt and pants and put them on the table before sitting down on the clean, expensive sofa. His mother drew a deep breath. Okay, tell me everything that happened. Promise you won't freak out? Izuku asked. If you have to ask that, I can't promise I won't, she answered. I got kidnapped by some gang when I was walking home from school. She started immediately breathing faster. He grabbed her hand and leaned closer to pull her against him. He spoke quietly once their heads were touching. I'm here, Mom. I'm safe. Dad saved me. He did? Wait, did he work with the kidnappers? She pulled away from the hug to meet Izuku's eyes.
No.
I think their leader used to work for Dad at some point, but Izuku paused. That blood is his. I know Dad is considered a villain, but he has still been keeping an eye on us. Izuku explained to her what had happened during his kidnapping. His mother's expression briefly changed from tense fear to surprise when Izuku talked about using his quirk. She settled on somewhere between fear and anger after he started telling her what had happened after his father arrived. So, he was lying about his quirk. I suspected that when your hair changed to look like his when he wasn't coloring it. Please tell me he at least took care of you afterwards. Using a quirk on someone's head like that. He did, Mom, Izuku assured and continued the story about how Dad had taken him to, well, he didn't know where, and helped him there with some doctor. He briefly referenced their talk about what is a villain but focused more on why his father had left them, how they would be in danger if they were connected to him, and about their quirk. Inko managed to keep seemingly calm, but Izuku could feel her squeezing his hand. He rubbed his forehead with his free hand. His mother snapped out of her thoughts and stared at him. "Are you okay?" "Mostly," Izuku answered. "Dad's doctor said I could have had permanent brain damage from that quirk that knocked me out, but Dad had some healing quirk. They said they need to treat me a few other times before it completely heals." "So, you are going to see him again?" "Yes, at least until I recover," and Izuku paused and looked down, face tense and fresh tears falling on the sofa. "I need to know more about him, even if he is a villain. I've spent too many years missing him even when I couldn't remember his face anymore." I don't think I can." "Izuku," his mother cried and pulled him into a hug. Izuku had inherited her tear ducts, so both their shirts got soaked before they started talking again. "I'm so sorry. He has been gone so long I didn't consider you might still be missing him, while I just ignored your questions and lied about where he was. I won't stop you from talking to him, but only once I see him." Izuku pulled back from the hug. "Mom, are you sure?" he asked, only to receive the sternest look she could come up with. "He is still a villain who might be plotting something. He is also my husband. Do not forget that. Now, how are you planning to meet him again?" "The guy with a warping quirk that helped Dad keep an eye on us, at least me, he's a teacher at my school. He's supposed to take me after school." "Then I'll be there," she said in her "this discussion is over" voice. She looked at the blood-stained clothes, holding in more tears, and got up. "I should wash those. There's food on the stove." She pointed at Izuku and switched to her most commanding voice that Izuku hadn't heard in years. "Don't go anywhere, and lay down if you start feeling worse in any way." "Yes, Mom," Izuku responded and went to eat. After sitting down by the dining table, he raised his hand to look at the palm and the little hole in it. "All for one," he muttered and turned his hand around. He should now have those other two quirks permanently. He tried to focus on the blade-like fire quirk. When he accidentally took Bakugo's quirk, there was a strange feeling with his own quirk itself, and mentally reaching for it. A flicker of fire appeared on the back of his hand and quickly spread into an oval-shaped mass of flames. Luckily, it didn't really burn him, though he could feel the uncomfortable heat. He was lucky he had taken off his long-sleeved top shirt before trying the quirk. It still didn't look like what he had been threatened with. He stared at the flame, breathing a little faster with every passing moment. "Izuku?" He spun around, raising his hand and open palm towards the sound. His fingers touched the flame he was still producing. He yelped at the same time as his chair fell on the ground. The fire disappeared and Izuku was left facing his mother, about to wash the floor with her tears again. Izuku stared at her for a while as his breathing calmed down. "Sorry, Mom," he said. "I don't think I'm as okay from that kidnapping as I thought." He glanced at his burned fingers. His mother grabbed his wrist and dragged him to the sink. Cold water felt good. They spent the rest of the evening sitting together, except when they got Izuku's clothes. His mother even tucked Izuku into bed for the first time in years. It didn't help him sleep any better, though. She barely let him leave to school on his own, checking the bandages on his fingers before he left. At least Izuku's head didn't cause any big problems. Just some dizziness when he got up, and he didn't tell his mother about that. At school, no one cared about him being injured or repeatedly rubbing his forehead. He had felt a bit dizzy again by the time he got to school and sat down. Unable to focus, Izuku spent most of the time staring at his bandaged fingers. If he was going to keep the quirks he took, since he didn't expect their owners to show up again, he'd have to learn to control them. Maybe he could even pretend one of them was his when he would go to high school. For a moment, Izuku considered asking help from the school's quirk counselor, but abandoned the idea. He had asked the man's help exactly once in the past, and the answer was the same as everyone else's. His quirk is villainous, and the only thing he should worry about should be not using it. Izuku sighed. There was only one person who could really help him control his quirks, at least only one who would. Something slapped him on the shoulder. Izuku's head snapped up to see the quickly retreating hand of a teacher, whose quirk let him reach quite far. "Since you seem so excited for class, it should be easy for you to solve this equation." the teacher said and pointed to the blackboard. Izuku quickly scanned everything that had been written, calculating as the impatient teacher kept staring at him. Bakugo muttered, "Useless." X equals 5 or -5, Izuku answered. The teacher glanced back at the equation he had written. Correct. That doesn't mean you can slack off. I'm not feeling too well, Izuku said honestly. Sure you aren't. The teacher continued the lesson without paying any more attention to Izuku, despite what he had said. This was a teacher, someone who's supposed to teach them how things worked, but he barely paid attention to the class himself. No wonder his classmates were so uncaring with these kind of adults in their lives. As soon as the class ended, Izuku got up and walked out, ignoring classmates who kept a close eye on him as he passed them. He didn't care and headed straight towards the teacher's lounge, scanning for faces until he found who he was looking for. Kuro-sensei. Young Midoriya, do you want to talk about something? Yes, somewhere. Izuku paused when the man put a hand to his shoulder. Small amounts of mist spread from the hand flowing around Izuku's shoulder. It was oddly comforting. Come with me, Kurogiri whispered, and gestured for Izuku to step in a nearby small stairwell. As soon as they were out of anyone's sight, a mass of mist encased Izuku. Any time before or with anyone else, Izuku might have been scared at the sudden darkness, but he had learned to relax when with Kuro-sensei. It was genuine relief. He still felt this amount of trust despite finding the teacher wasn't who he thought. The darkness was gone as fast as it came, and Izuku was standing on the roof of the school. You wanted to discuss something. I assume you don't want me to take you to master this early. There is actually something I should talk to you about. I think I mostly needed a friend. I've been thinking about everything wrong with this place more than usually. You've been the only nice person in this school, and yesterday, Izuku paused. You didn't talk much, but I could sense how you felt. I wanted to thank you for actually caring. He chose to not ask about the men Kurogiri had made disappear. The man stepped closer, putting a hand on Izuku's shoulder again. It is my duty here to protect you above all else. That is the mission Master has given me. Dad, Izuku said. He said something about holding you back. It's more than a mission, isn't it? Kurogiri didn't say anything, but mist leaked from his head and hands. Izuku smiled. You don't need to answer. There's actually another thing I needed to tell you. Mom wants to come see Dad also. I'm not sure how Master would feel about that, Kurogiri responded. That's why I wanted you to know beforehand. Please let Dad know before we go. I will. Do you wish for anything else? Kurogiri asked. Why are you saying it like you are going to do anything I say? What is thy bidding, my master? Kurogiri said without even the smallest twitch on his face. Izuku chuckled. I didn't know you do movie quotes. I don't, Kurogiri responded with a hint of confusion. Izuku looked at him with the same. The school bell distracted both of them from their thoughts. We should go, Izuku said. He stepped towards a door that led inside, but his vision blurred, and he stumbled after just 2 steps. He was saved from a meeting with the roof by Kurogiri's mist. Thank you, Kuro-sensei. I mean, Kurogiri. You should have told me how serious your symptoms are. It wasn't that bad when I was sitting, and I had to come to school anyway for you. I can't exactly tell the school nurse what happened. That would not help you. I shall send you to your father immediately to ensure your health. I think I can manage. I can't just disappear in the middle of the school day. I will see to it this won't cause you problems. Your health is most important. Izuku closed his eyes, his vision still not normal, now further blurred by a new tear. He rubbed his forehead in resignation. Okay, I admit I'm not feeling that great, but Mom is still coming here after school. You need to bring her when she comes, Izuku said. Kurogiri looked at him for a moment in silence. Will you? Yes, if that is what you wish. Thank you. I have everything I need. You can send me. Mist burst out of Kurogiri, covering him all around, and began whirling in front of him to form the warp gate. Izuku looked at the impressive quirk, promising he'd ask 1,000 questions about it sooner or later. He stepped through, and in an instant he was in the same dimly lit room as before. His dad, all for one, was sitting in front of a computer with multiple wires and pipes attached to him, especially a big pipe going into his throat. He turned around. For the first time, Izuku saw his father's entire face, what was left of it. The only part that looked somewhat normal was his mouth, and it tensed as he noticed Izuku. He didn't question Izuku's early arrival and gestured toward the hospital bed that Kurogiri had warped Izuku next to. He welcomed the chance to lay back down. "How are you feeling?" he asked. He typed something on the computer and came to sit next to Izuku. He brought his hand to Izuku's forehead. The familiar green glow appeared, immediately easing Izuku's headache. "The doctor said I was good to go if I could walk straight. I don't think I can anymore." Sitting wasn't too bad all considered. It got worse when I was standing talking with Kuro-sen. "Kurogiri," Izuku explained, already feeling a little better. His father smirked. "You did right to talk with him. My quirk should be more efficient now that you are still rested from the night." "If you can call that rest," Izuku responded quietly and sighed in relief. He was feeling better than he had all day or night. His eyelids slipped closed. "Inko?" The single word penetrated the darkness of sleep, and Izuku blinked, trying to get back to consciousness. His father was still standing next to him, opposite to Kurogiri, and, "Just so you know, I left a letter explaining the situation with someone you don't know. If anything happens to either of us, it goes to police." "Mom!" Izuku's words were muffled under an oxygen mask placed on his face. She was instantly leaning over him, seemingly ignoring the literal villains in the room. "Izuku, what did you do to my baby?" That didn't last for long. Father raised one finger. "Our baby, and I have been treating him after he sought my help when the symptoms started worsening." He paused for a moment, and when he continued talking, he did so with a steady, calm voice. "You may not approve of what I am or that I left you, but believe it or not, I have not forgotten that I am a father." "Doesn't look that way to me." The two stood still, glaring at each other, or as much as a faceless man could glare at least. Neither backed down. The edges of Izuku's oxygen mask started getting wet. "Stop, please stop," he cried out, making both his parents turn towards him. "Can't we just be a family for one day? Please, I can't even remember when we were all together last. It's the one thing I hoped for even more than getting a quirk." His vision got blurry again, this time from tears, but he could feel two bodies leaning down for one big hug. Chapter 4. Father and Son. "I'm going, Mom," Izuku announced while putting on his shoes. His voice, as most days recently, was more cheerful than it had been in years. His mother rushed into the hall to see him. "Not until you tell how you are feeling, honestly. Bit of a headache, and I think I'm still getting tired faster, but no dizziness since last week." "See," Izuku responded. To prove he was telling the truth, he raised his left leg and stood on one foot before hopping close enough to hug his mother. "Don't listen to your classmates. Don't stay with your father too late, and don't believe a word he says." Izuku chuckled at his mother's standard instructions. Despite her words and a reasonable suspicion towards his dad, Izuku knew she had been happier since they had been reunited, even if she told him to stop spying on her. It might have been solely because Izuku was happier to have both his parents in his life, but he was grateful for anything that made his mother happy and didn't mind wearing the tracker watch either. There were still issues in his life. His mother's first instruction was even harder to follow now that he knew his father was a villain, and they made Izuku think more about his words violating his mother's third instruction. He forced those thoughts out of his mind before pulling away from the hug. His mother deserved this happiness without starting a discussion on the flaws of society. Instead, he grinned. "I'll try not to stay too late, but Dad promised he'd start teaching me more about my quirk, since I've gotten better now." Izuku pushed the door open and left before he made either of them cry. He didn't want to go to school in wet clothes, even if the weather was sunny. He walked enjoying the spring day, completely ignoring he'd still have to spend hours in the hellhole they called school. At least he had a lesson with Kuro-sensei after lunch. His calm ended when a loud roar echoed along the street. He looked to the side on an intersection. A giant man was standing on an elevated railroad roaring. He swung his arm, knocking down one of the support pillars of the overhead electric cables. Izuku gasped, but something grabbed the pillar before it could prove a real threat to the bystanders, and he could hear people start talking vibrantly about the hero death arms. Izuku already had notes on him, so he focused on the giant criminal. A gigantification quirk, Izuku muttered. He pulled out his notebook to add notes about the unknown giant, as someone nearby verbally mocked the giant for doing small crime with a quirk like that. It wasn't like he could use the quirk much with how the laws were without breaking the law or managing to become a hero. Did they want him to commit worse crime then? Not that going on a rampage like that made sense either. Considering how agitated the giant seemed to be, he was probably at his max size, and it came with some mutations in his head shape. Something whooshed over Izuku. It didn't take long for him to recognize the hero Kimiri Woods. Izuku forgot the simple gigantification quirk and focused on the hero's arbor quirk. On the surface, the wooden body that could stretch and split was obvious, but Izuku didn't have a clue about the actual limits or capabilities of the quirk beyond that. After evading a few swings, the hero prepared to launch his special binding move only for another giant person to appear and kick the criminal out of the way, causing considerable collateral damage to the street below in the process. No one cared though, since the giant hero was a good-looking young woman, and people were more interested in taking pictures than complaining about unnecessary damage. Izuku put his notebook away and continued towards school. The school day, first of the new school year, started normal enough with no one talking to or approaching Izuku. He, for his part, focused on thinking of how to get his parents to get along better. Despite being about family conflict, it was a hopeful train of thought to him. He barely noticed the glares of his classmates as he walked past them to his lonely desk. The teacher came in the classroom right after Izuku. He was one of the worst ones in the school and had for years ignored anything Bakugo and others had done to Izuku with no consideration for how his own actions might impact the ostracized student. Not surprising considering how he always praised students with strong showy quirks, talking about how he dreamed of having a student of his become a great hero someday. And so began the first lesson of the school year. "You are all third years now," the teacher started and grabbed a pile of papers from his desk. "It's time to start thinking seriously about your futures. I would hand out these future career forms, but I assume you all want to be heroes." He threw the papers in the air with the final declaration as the entire class got exited and started showing off their quirks. Izuku held back a grimace. Encouraging was one thing. Izuku had desperately needed someone to do so for years, but there was no way everyone, or even most of the class, would ever become heroes. The man completely failed to guide any student who wasn't up to the most demanding and selective career path there was. The man continued talking. "Yes, you all have wonderful quirks, but you know that it's against the rules to use them in school." The reminder of rules was not especially stern. "Sensei," Bakugo shouted, "don't lump me in with these losers. As if I had anything like their crappy quirks." Heh. Of course, he only cared about the superiority of his quirk, not that most of the class had the drive to really become heroes anyway. Izuku hated to admit it, but Bakugo was the one with the best chances, ignoring his attitude. His behavior was far from that of a hero, but no hero school entrance exam had a test for garbage personality. Everyone in the class recognized this, shouting at the bully to get over himself only to be called extras. "Ah, Bakugo, you of course," the teacher started, his voice getting more enthusiastic with every word. "Must be aiming for UA High School." The declaration made the class gasp, reciting the difficulty of getting into the top school. Bakugo jumped on his desk to stand over the rest of the class and declared his greatness and his goal to become the best hero. To become rich mainly, he wasn't afraid to say. He was the poster child of why hero schools needed better vetting for their students, not that they cared. The heroes teaching at the schools obviously benefited from the high-paying celebrity status, no matter what kind of people it attracted. While Bakugo was posturing, the teacher decided to drop a verbal bomb on Izuku. "Weren't you also going for UA Midoriya?" Bakugo fell silent for a moment along with the whole class. It ended as soon as it had begun when they burst into laughter and mockery. "Huh, Midoriya? No way. A villain at the top hero school? Yeah, right. He'd have better chance if he was quirkless. He's seriously still thinking that he will be something." Izuku stayed in his seat, eyes focused on his notebook without responding to the garbage he'd have to take for another year at least, probably rest of his life. The teacher did nothing to stop it. Izuku tried to distract himself by imagining how things would have gone if it was Kuro-sensei's class, but thinking of what Kuro-sensei might have done in this situation made him remember what happened to the man that had caused his brain damage, how his face had twisted in horror and his screams had filled the room they had been in. Izuku shivered and focused on staring at his notebook. Eventually, the teacher concluded that, despite his ignoring the career guidance process, he would still hold some form of a lesson and told the class to sit and quiet down. The remainder of the lesson passed for Izuku in a haze. It was nothing new, but the contrast to his earlier happy thoughts was a big one. The incident at the beginning of class had also reminded him of another problem. What would he do with his life? For most of his childhood, he had dreamed of becoming a hero. That's why he had also expressed interest for Yue recently. He had not been so sure. The more he thought about everything wrong in the world, the less attractive being a hero seemed, even if he wanted to help people, even if becoming one would have been the biggest possible middle finger to Bakugo and their classmates. Meeting his father and talking about the meanings of heroes and villains had done nothing to make him more excited of being a hero. Still, he didn't know anything else he wanted. What career could he do, let alone want to do? He just said Yue if anyone asked what school he wanted to go to, got laughed at and moved on. If nothing else, it was a prestigious school even outside the hero course. The class came to an end with Izuku still in his thoughts, not even scribbling anymore. His notebook laying closed on the desk. A hand reached out to grab the notebook and took it away before Izuku realized what had happened. He followed the notebook to Bakugo, who had already taken a step back from Izuku's reach. He had his usual arrogant expression with a tint of wariness in his eyes that did not slip past Izuku's notice. "We ain't done here, Deku." "What's that, Katsuki?" one of Bakugo's goons asked. "Quirk analysis for my future? Seriously, this guy? Are you looking for good quirks to steal?" "Oh, come on," Izuku said, tired of the shit. "Give it back." Without a word, Bakugo slapped his hands on each side of the notebook, releasing small explosions from both. Izuku froze for a moment. The notebook's covers were all torn up and the whole thing was blackened and smoking. "Why?" he whispered. Bakugo just tossed the notebook over his shoulder and out the window. "The best heroes out there, well?" Bakugo started. "They showed signs of greatness even as students. I'll be the first and only hero from this crappy public middle school. The first to win the honor of becoming a student at UA High Hero course. Guess I'm just a perfectionist." Bakugo held his hands open as smoke rose from them. Izuku turned his head away, looking at the open window rather than listening to the walking garbage fire. "In other words, don't you dare to apply to UA Nerd. Not even the general studies for losers that can't be heroes." Failing to get a reaction, the trio of bullies started leaving as Izuku still stared out of the window. Of course, they kept jeering at him as they went. Then Bakugo said it. "You want to be a hero so bad? I've got a time-saving idea for you. If you think you'll have a more heroic quirk in your next life, go take a swan dive off the roof." Izuku shook as he heard the words. He spun around, his open palm up, power of all for one crackling within his body. Bakugo tensed and quickly took a defensive stance with one of his hands also raised, explosions flashing from it. He was holding his other hand much lower, but open, clearly ready to blast the entire room if Izuku moved. "Don't you try." After confirming Izuku wasn't moving, Bakugo left with a sneer, leaving him alone in the empty class. Izuku sighed and, after waiting a moment, he departed the now empty classroom, heading to the yard. Of course, his notebook had landed in the fish pool that the school had. For a second, Izuku thought he should do something. This was a new low even for Bakugo. He gave up the thought. It wasn't like the school was going to do anything. Maybe if he didn't have his parents and took Bakugo's advice to jump off the roof. For anything less, it was pointless to complain to teachers about the school's #1 candidate for future hero. He stayed there leaning over the water. He brought his free hand on his head. What's the point? Young Midoriya? Izuku turns to see Kurogyri in his human form, though with plenty of mist leaking from behind his ears. Izuku squeezed his hands into a fist, pulling his own hair and grumbling about the already abused notebook. "Take me to my dad," was all he said. Izuku stepped out of the darkness of Kurogiri's warp gate and squinted his eyes. He was not in the dimly lit room full of medical equipment. If anything, the room was as far from it as possible. He was standing in the middle of a luxurious living room with large windows on two sides that exposed the city below. It took a few seconds for Izuku to recognize the city as Tokyo, and he was near the top of some skyscraper overlooking it. Was this where his father had lived all these years? Izuku? Izuku turned around to face his father. For the first time, the man was not dressed in his fine suit, but a simple white-collared shirt and black jeans. He had the lower half of his helmet on for its breathing assistance. He came closer to Izuku. Even with most of his face gone, there was visible tenseness around the breathing mask. Did your symptoms get worse again? No, school did, Izuku responded, gritting his teeth. He sat on the nearest sofa, slumped against the backrest, staring at the ceiling. I would ask what happened, but Kurogiri has kept me well informed. Better than you have with your mother, his father said, and sat next to Izuku. Well, what do you mean? If she knew half of what Kurogiri has reported to me, you would not be in that place anymore. I'm surprised she had you go in such an average school in the first place. It's the school for the area we have always lived in, and I don't want to worry her. It's not like things would be any better anywhere else anyway. I would still have had to either pretend to be quirkless or deal with them knowing I have your quirk. Sorry, I didn't mean. It's just how people view it. That is okay, Izuku. I know well how this society works. I saw its formation. Izuku sighed. Some days I wish you could have replaced all of the teachers with Kurogiris. That might have been a challenge to do without raising suspicion even for me. It has been difficult enough to keep one of him from going too far. You should have noticed by now he has become protective over you, even beyond what his job requires. I did notice. He wanted to burn the school while you were sick to have you transferred without talking to Inko. I have wondered how much that was impacted by my genes and quirk within you. What do you mean? Izuku asked and raised his head. It's a matter that concerns my villain activities, some you might find difficult to accept despite how you might feel about this society. I see. This time Izuku looked down. But if it's about Kuro-sensei, if our quirk does something to him? Izuku looked at his palm. I'll keep whatever you say secret, but I'd like to know. Father got up and touched his chin. He stepped in front of Izuku. I guess it will help you decide if you can truly accept my presence without covering it in ignorance. Kurogiri is not fully human anymore. Not human. He used to be. Resisting the society itself, and those who created it requires force with unstoppable power and unquestionable loyalty. The doctor has spent years studying myself to modify human bodies to sustain multiple quirks. You should never give people quirks carelessly, by the way, at least no more than one and nothing highly powerful. Not unless you want to risk them becoming vegetables. Most people's bodies don't adapt to a growing number of different quirks like ours. Izuku gulped. The injury won't be permanent if you remove the quirk quickly enough, and people can usually adapt better if new quirks relate to their original ones, but even then, it is limited. So, the doctor and I found a way to create artificial humans that were created specifically to hold multiple quirks or quirk combinations. Before you said he was modifying human bodies, not creating them? Izuku said. As his father kept facing him wordlessly, he had his answer. Dad, was he dead or alive when you changed him? Dying. So, you could say you saved him by making him? Nomu. And that depends on what you consider saving a person. Kurogiri's body might be a modified version of his old one, but his mind is entirely artificial. His body was more adaptive to new quirks than most, so his brain could recover enough to build a new personality over time, though still with absolute loyalty, one tied to my genes and the quirk that helped create him, which you share. I never told him to obey you, only to protect, yet he seems to do both. Izuku stared at his father, and new tears started dripping to his already drying cheeks. He slumped down, holding his face in his hands. Figures that the only person who cared about me did so only because he was forced to buy my quirk. Oh, I very much doubt that. If his actions were solely directed by our quirk's power over him, I would only have needed to command him once to restrain his actions. Unless you commanded him to burn the school or leak mist whenever you get abused? The words were strangely comforting, but at best they left Izuku confused instead of grieving. Is there any way to know? If you want to see what he would do, you can watch your words. Avoid anything that he can consider an order and see what happens. I will. Izuku sat in silence for a long time, still holding his face. His father left the room at some point. Only when he returned and spoke did Izuku raise his head and leaned back. You can sit here as long as you want, but if you want to use this time effectively, there is more you should learn about your quirk. The risk of giving them is only a small part. Or perhaps you want to talk about school. Aren't fathers and sons supposed to talk about school? He placed a jug of juice and a pair of glasses on a table in front of the sofa. I shouldn't listen to them. It's not like I put much value in their opinions, but it's the same every single day. Izuku sighed and stared forward at nothing. I'm so tired of it. They sat in silence for a moment before Izuku continued. Can we talk about quirks instead? Of course. Have you tried using your new quirks? I figured out how to activate them, but I can't control them well, and they remind me about how I got them. So, you need to learn control and help to get over those events. If we're lucky, both have the same solution. Izuku stared at him questioningly. If those quirks are tied to your memories of the events, then having control over them might help you control your feelings of those events. Now get up. They stood, and he led Izuku to an open space between the sofas and a large dining table. Show me one of the quirks. Izuku did as he was told, and a few seconds later, an oval-shaped mass of flames lit over the back of his palm, licking his skin. It didn't quite burn him, but the heat was still uncomfortable. Seeing the flames, he started immediately breathing faster and turned his head. Father placed his hand on Izuku's shoulder as other came to the side of his head, pushing it back. Look at it. Forget where it came from. This is your power now, and it will bend to your will like all others. Forced to look at the flaming quirk, Izuku was able to gradually control his breathing. He forced the memories to the back of his thoughts. You are in control of yourself. Good. Let's see if you can get it to change form to something more useful. Figuring how to manipulate something that till recently did not exist in his body was even more challenging than Izuku had expected, but his father's advice and constant presence helped greatly. He soon forgot school and the crap people in his life. The day flew by. Izuku only realized the time when he looked out of the large windows to see the sun halfway below the horizon. Perhaps you should head home now, his father said. You will need to study what you missed today. Kurogiri can cover your absence with school administration to a point, but he cannot study for you or Kaminko. If you think so, Izuku said. One more time he activated the flaming blade. No, the dragon blade he decided to name it, and forced it to stretch out into a more sword-like shape. He looked at it for a moment. It brought back the memories, but his breathing remained steady. He could control both of them, his lungs and his quirk. If you keep training, I will teach you how to combine and use multiple quirks simultaneously, his father promised, making Izuku smile. Izuku soon stepped out of Kurogiri's portal in his own backyard. He wanted to say something to the Misty Nomu, but did not know what to say. He could only thank Kurogiri before stepping in the mist. He headed straight to the back door, a little surprised at the dark building. He checked his phone still on silent mode from school. There was one message from his mother about being out in case he returned first. She didn't mention anything about school to Izuku's relief. His father had fed him, so he went straight to his room to study, just briefly glancing at a news feed on his phone. There were some titles about the fight in the morning, but most others were about something called sludge villain attack, one dead. Izuku would have read further, but he reached his room. He put down the phone to change clothes, grimacing a little at singe marks on his sleeve. He was lucky to not have lit his clothes on fire. He was just taking his books from his backpack when the doorbell rang. He headed to the door a little wary, taking his phone with him. They didn't have visitors often, maybe Bakugo's mom Mitsuki sometimes. The mothers had a much better relationship than their sons. Just one more reason for Izuku to not talk about everything that happened at school. He opened the front door. He did not expect two police officers, and some middle-aged woman in civilian clothing, all of them with serious expressions. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. Chapter 5. The News. Izuku stared at the trio at his door as dread consumed him. When he met the eyes of the civilian woman, his own began to tear up. "Are you Izuku Midoriya?" one of the police asked. Izuku could only nod. "Is your father home?" Izuku gulped. "No, he's away a lot because of his work. Please tell me what's going on." "Your mother Inko Midoriya was killed earlier today by a villain." Izuku stood in front of them with shaky legs that soon collapsed as he fell to his knees on the doorstep. He grabbed his chest. He was gasping for air, barely able to breathe, like something was squeezing his throat. The middle-aged woman pushed through between the two police officers and kneeled to embrace Izuku in her arms. "Oh, for goodness sake, have you ever told these kinds of news to a kid?" she said, and then spoke to Izuku in softer tones. "I am a social worker. You can call me Aisha. We will explain everything and get you anything you need, but you should be sitting for that. May we have your permission to come in?" The only sound Izuku could make was quiet sniffing, but he nodded to her. "Thank you. Don't worry about crying. You don't need to keep anything in." And Aisha escorted Izuku inside, still holding him close. She settled him on the big sofa and let him stare into the empty air for a long time. "Wah," Izuku rasped. "What happened?" And Aisha nodded to the police officers. "There was a villain with a quirk that turned his body into a sludge form. He was being chased after a robbery. We believe that he wanted to utilize his quirk to hide in your mother's body and use it to escape." Izuku gagged loudly and felt a new clump in his throat. "The sludge villain? You know him?" one of the police asked. "I saw a headline." Izuku paused to sob. "I didn't have time to read him. Oh, there was a video?" He scrambled to get his phone, and Aisha put her hand on his. "I would not recommend you watch that. Dealing with a loss like this takes time. It may be too much right away." Izuku yanked his phone from her grasp. "It's already too much. I still need to see for myself, to know." He quickly found the news again and pulled up a video. The situation was already going on when the camera had started. A gas station had been damaged and caught fire. In the middle of it all was the sludge villain, not even human-shaped, only recognizable as a person because it had an oversized face with a wicked evil grin, and under it, being pulled up to the sludge, was a human shape. The image was too small to truly identify the person, but Izuku knew. A group of heroes led by the Death Arm were at the scene. They grabbed a few civilians caught in the middle of things and retreated with them. Death Arm attacked the villain once. Then he ran away. The heroes withdrew further away from the villain, not even trying to help his mom anymore. Mount Lady was stuck on some smaller street, too stupid to shrink so she could get closer. Izuku started shaking as the video progressed, but not of grief. "Why aren't they doing anything?" Izuku screamed. The camera moved from the useless heroes to the sludge monster and his still struggling victim. There was a sudden movement, and she bent backwards in a snapping motion and stopped. Izuku stopped breathing. His dinner tried to climb up his throat. He couldn't see the video anymore as both his eyes and the screen were wet with tears. He could barely hear the pompous declaration that he used to love, but now only felt rage. "It is fine now." "Why?" "Because I am here." "No, it's not," Izuku muttered, and with a scream threw the phone across the room, almost hitting one of the police officers. "Hey, watch it." "They did nothing," Izuku shouted, ignoring the police. Heroes are supposed to help people, risk their lives to help people, and they just watched her die. They threw one punch and gave up. And where are they now? Not here for sure. That is easy to say watching videos from a nice sofa. You don't know what their work involves. They're busy with more urgent things. What do you think you're doing? And Aisha hissed at the police. Izuku didn't care about her, the police officer's words echoing in his mind. They don't look that busy when there are cameras around. Yes, let it all out. Seeking someone to blame is normal. You will get over it, and Aisha said. Izuku tensed and began shaking. Over it? You expect me to watch so-called heroes not even trying to do their job and act like that's okay and normal? It might be normal, But it's not okay. He raised his head just in time to see one of the police open his mouth to say something again. Izuku's wet eyes narrowed. Get out. Excuse me? The officer raised his eyebrows. You've told me what you needed to and more. Now, get out of my home. Hold on. I know you're sad and angry, but you shouldn't be alone today, and we need to determine what happens to you next. And Aisha tried to reason in a soothing voice. No, you don't. I still have a father. Izuku pulled away from Aisha's grasp and started stumbling towards his phone next to the wall. That might be the case, but you said he is not here right now. You still shouldn't be alone. We have facilities and people that take care of people in situations like yours. Izuku took the phone. Despite a seriously cracked screen, it still seemed to work. He hesitated with calling his father right away. Talking with a top-level villain in front of two police officers didn't seem smart, but they also weren't listening to him, as if he was a little kid. He didn't have time to make the call as his phone began ringing. It was his father's number. Izuku took a shaky breath before answering. Dad. His father's voice was calm, but faster than usually. Izuku, we need to talk. I know, Izuku cried out. Police just came here with some social worker to tell me. Mom, she's gone. I see, his father responded in a more somber tone. I will get you. Thanks, Dad. They want to take me somewhere. They think it's better than being alone until you get here. But he was interrupted by the doorbell ringing repeatedly. Everyone went quiet for a moment. Sorry, someone else is at the door, Izuku said. You should see who it is, his father advised. It may help us decide what you should do next. Izuku walked to the door. The police officers followed, but kept a little distance. Izuku opened the door and was instantly grabbed into a hug by a teary-eyed Mitsuki Bakugo. Izuku froze, uncertain of how to react. The woman had been a good friend to his mother, but she also raised the greatest torment in his life. Izuku, she started. Inko, she's dash. I know, Izuku shouted as the sad cry was tainted by annoyance. He pulled out of Mitsuki's hold. What are you doing here? What am I? I came to make sure you're okay. So, you don't need to be alone. I am not okay, and you can't help it. None of you can. Izuku raised his voice and looked back at the earlier trio, making Mitsuki notice them too. I just want to be left alone so I can talk with Dad without having to deal with all of you pretending you care or can help somehow. Izuku! The sound from the phone was barely loud enough for Izuku to notice. He brought the phone back to his ear. If the police don't want to leave you alone, you should ask if your mother's friend can stay with you until I get to you. She should be easier to handle than the authorities. If you can handle a Bakugo, that is. I will. Get a flight. And be there in the morning. You can call me again when you get more privacy. Morning. Okay, I'll try that. Izuku sighed and ended the call. He looked at the police and Aisha with tired annoyance and pointed at Mitsuki. She's been my mother's friend almost as long as I've been alive. Will you leave me alone if she sticks around until my dad gets here? The police officers looked at each other and Aisha spoke first. It should be okay. It's always better to stay with someone you are familiar with. We need to confirm her identity before leaving. Fine, do that and get out. He walked past them back inside. He wanted to go straight to his room and be alone, but Mitsuki would only follow him there. Instead, he collapsed on the sofa, exhausted from dealing with people. He didn't take his eyes away from the ceiling even as steps approached. Mitsuki kneeled next to him. Izuku. Izuku did not respond. Izuku, please look at me. Why? Izuku said without looking at her. You're only here so I don't need to deal with those other people. Otherwise, I would not want to be anywhere near a Bakugo right now, or ever. What's that supposed to mean? The woman's fiery personality started leaking into her words despite everything that had happened. Izuku grimaced. He could almost see Katsuki in her place. You raised Bakugo Katsuki, right? Of course I raised my son. So, you are at least as shit a parent as he is a person. Now you listen to...
No.
Izuku shouted and got up from the sofa. You listen to me. Your son is a walking garbage fire you threw dynamite into. He is the bane of my life. He is worse than everyone else at school combined. Just today, he mocked me in front of the whole class, blew up my notebook, and told me to kill myself. Izuku paused, breathing fast like he had just run a marathon. He was too tired to be polite and watch his words like he usually did. Mitsuki, on the other hand, seemed to have forgotten how to speak as she stared at Izuku. I never knew, she gasped. Of course you didn't. No one cares if an outcast gets tormented, especially when everyone thinks the bully might get into a hero school even if it's only by luck of birth. What's the life of one worthless kid if school can get such prestige? But why didn't you say anything until now? Izuku got up and turned away. Not like it would have helped much. It's the same everywhere. Plus, Mom didn't have many friends besides you. Not a problem anymore. And I was afraid what Bakugo Katsuki might do. Izuku sighed. I think I'll want to start over somewhere else with Dad. The further away it is from your family, the better. He started walking away. If you have to stay, stay downstairs. I'm happier if I don't need to see you or your family ever again. No, she said. Izuku stopped. If what you are telling me is true, I need to get to the bottom of it and straighten the brat. I'll call him here, and we can fix it. Izuku spun around, activating his new Dragon Blade quirk, and pointed it right at Mitsuki's face. Izuku's arm shook so much it was visible even on the already wavy blade. They stared at each other for a while, neither daring to say a word until Izuku's arm dropped and the fire disappeared. Izuku stared at the floor away from Mitsuki. It took him a moment to regain control over his own mouth as he grabbed his face with the same hand he had just threatened Mitsuki with. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that, but I don't want to deal with your son, especially not today. No, I should be the one to apologize, but what? Was that quirk? Izuku completed the question and looked at the hole in his palm. I was kidnapped a while back and had to take it from one of the kidnappers. I haven't shown it to anyone since they would just accuse me of stealing, Akatsuki especially. Now can I go back to cry in my room, or do you still need something from me? Kin, of course. I'll stay down here for tonight, in case you need to talk to someone. Izuku walked upstairs without saying anything more, entered his room and collapsed on the bed face down. In seconds, the pillow was soaked wet as he began sobbing. Time passed. Izuku didn't know how much. It was completely dark once he raised his head. He turned onto his back and took out the cracked phone. He thought about calling his father again, but the video was still open. It hurt to even think about it, but he could not turn away from his mother's last moments alive even if they were horrifying. Even after crying for so long, he had to watch the video several times to clear his eyes of tears before he could really see it. With every viewing, his anger at the heroes rose, and All Might's words especially caused him to boil inside. The supposed hero punched away the villain too late and dared to stand there, over the dead corpse of Izuku's mother, like he had achieved some kind of glorious victory. Izuku's eyes rose to his All Might posters and a shelf full of All Might merch he had gathered over the years. His fanboying over the hero had degraded over time, but all the stuff was still in his room, and now he only saw red looking at them. He jumped off the bed and rushed across the room. The fiery blades appeared from both of his hands, and he started slashing at the posters. The quirk burned through the posters, leaving black lines of scorched, smoking wall, but didn't cut as well as one might have expected from a quirk called a blade. He stopped for a moment, staring at the All Might figurines and other merch, focusing his anger even further. In his eyes, he only saw the supposed symbol of peace standing victoriously over the defeated sludge villain, as if he hadn't even noticed the corpse next to him. Barely thinking, Izuku tapped into all his quirks. The blade twisted and narrowed and started to vibrate. After a few seconds, any restraint broke, and with a roar of anger and agony, Izuku swung his arms forward, cutting through not just the figurines but the shelves and into the wall behind. Wood smoked, plastic melted, and paper instantly caught fire with open flame. After several swings, the whole bookshelf collapsed into a smoking pile, forcing Izuku to jump back. Running steps echoed from behind his door, and without even knocking, Mitsuki ran inside. Are you? She paused mid-sentence. Izuku was still staring at the pile of what he had destroyed, calming barely enough to deactivate his quirk. Mitsuki stepped past him and rummaged around her purse. She pulled out a miniature fire extinguisher and sprayed with it wherever she saw smoke, even digging into the pile of rubble to make sure she got all of the flames. Once the extinguisher was empty, she turned slowly to Izuku and gulped. Are you okay? I mean physically. Yes, Izuku responded and sat down on his bed. He pointed at the pile of rubble that was no longer smoldering. Thanks for that. It's not the first time I've had to put out fires. Katsuki. Sorry, you don't want to talk about him. She paused for a moment and gestured to the rubble. Do you want to talk about this? Yes, but not with you, Izuku answered and picked up his phone. At least Mitsuki listened and turned to leave. Then she stopped and Izuku groaned internally. She pulled something else from her purse, a letter. Your mother left this with me. She told me to keep it in case something happened to her. I was supposed to open it if anything happened, but since you were here... Izuku's eyes widened, remembering his mother's threat. Just so you know, I left a letter explaining the situation with someone you don't know. If anything happens to either of us, it goes to the police. He reached out to grab the letter and hold it against his chest. Thank you. She looked at him for a while, but left without complaint. Izuku sat on the bed, phone on his ear. Dad. He talked for a long time, laying down and falling into a restless sleep at some point mid-call. Nightmares of his kidnapping had been replaced by visions of his mother covered in and broken by the sludge, with All Might's unending grin hovering above her. He snapped awake as soon as an alarm on his phone started ringing and sprang up to a sitting position with his arm up defensively. It took him a few seconds to realize this was not part of the dream. It was just morning and his normal school day wake-up time. He dragged himself to the bathroom and for the first time since getting the news saw himself in the mirror. His hair was even messier than usually, his cheeks and undersides of his eyes were reddened, and his eyes just seemed tired despite having just slept all night. As poor as the sleep had been, the weight of everything had pushed his shoulders and head down to the point he had to consciously turn upward to see his reflection. Izuku didn't feel any of the usual rush to get ready for school, so he decided to get a shower going and stand under the stream of hot water for an unknown amount of time. He only left after hearing the muted ring of his phone and ran to his room wet and naked to pick up the call. Dad? Yes. Do you still want to leave? Completely? Yes, Izuku answered. Without Mom, there is nothing for me here. Then pack what you need for the first few days. I will get you soon. I think Mitsuki Bakugo is still here. Don't worry. That is actually a good thing. Simply disappearing could raise suspicion. She can witness you leaving with your caring father. But you? Izuku started asking, remembering his father's appearance. I have my means. You don't need to worry about that in addition to everything else. Okay, Izuku said, and they ended the call. Still generally slumped and head down, Izuku stared at the small puddle he had dripped on the floor and went back to the bathroom to dry up. At least the shower had washed the worst marks of crying from his face. After dressing, he got out some suitcases from his mom's closet, barely holding back another wave of tears as he had to cross her bedroom. It did not take long to pack. He filled half the suitcases with his notebooks, school books, and some important papers and dumped clothes on top of them. At the last moment, he remembered to get some photo books from Mother's drawers. He made sure to not look into them, knowing the photographs would break him. Coming back from his mother's bedroom, Izuku caught a faint scent of food coming from downstairs. Mitsuki really had stayed then. Listening to the quiet sounds of cooking, Izuku's self-control nearly broke again, imagining his mother preparing breakfast while the smell made his stomach growl. It couldn't be helped. He put the last of his things in the suitcases and started dragging them downstairs. The clanging of the wheeled suitcases attracted Mitsuki from the kitchen. What are you doing? Dad is going to pick me up soon, Izuku responded in a monotone voice. Did you make breakfast? Oh, yes. At least she did not try to push him to go to school. Izuku left the suitcases next to the stairs and headed past her to the kitchen. Thank you. He was surprised arriving at the kitchen table. Mitsuki had raided through their cabinets and gone beyond expectations with a full Japanese breakfast with rice, natto, eggs, grilled fish, and vegetable-heavy miso soup and tea. He looked up to Mitsuki, who stood right outside the kitchen, giving him space. "Sorry how I treated you last night. Despite everything else, you were still the only person who showed up without it being your job. I'm actually starting to feel a bit sad we might not meet again." "Don't say that," Mitsuki pleaded. "Even if you are going to live with your father elsewhere, you can still visit anytime." "We'll see. Maybe after Katsuki moves away from your house." "Is it really? What all has he done?" Izuku kept looking at the woman, his eyes slowly turning sterner. "It's a long list. Might take some time to make. Do you want me to sort it alphabetically or chronologically?" Mitsuki stared at him for a moment, but soon averted her gaze, her face tense. "I think you have already told me enough. I'll be in the living room if you need anything." Izuku had nothing to say to that. He just wanted to be outside of the blast zone before Mitsuki met her son the next time. He still found it difficult to stay annoyed at the woman while eating her cooking. He was just finishing when his phone notified him of a message. He glanced at it once and hurried to the front door. The man behind it was simultaneously familiar and not. His hair was almost identical to Izuku's, but green, as his had been before, manifesting all for one. Two pairs of green eyes met his, though they felt strangely empty. The man's lips were partially covered by his jacket's high collar turned upwards despite warm spring weather. He kneeled with arms open wide. "Izuku." If Izuku had any doubts of the new face, the voice made him certain it was his father. He jumped towards his father, bringing his own arms around him. As his head pressed against his father's neck, he felt something strange right under the man's chin, where he had a breathing tube. Izuku couldn't see it for some reason, but he could still feel it. It didn't matter. He stayed right there sobbing until his father let go and nudged him to do the same. Izuku gave his father some space, but even as he got up, the man put a hand on his shoulder. "It will be okay, son," he said and looked up. "I don't believe we have been introduced. My name is Hisashi Midoriya. Mitsuki Bakugo." Izuku turned around to Mitsuki, who was looking at them from inside. "I want to thank you for supporting my son at this difficult time and sticking with him even with the friction I heard there was." "Yes, seems I need to confront my own son on some things," she bowed. "I apologize for all the pain he has caused your son, for my failure as a parent. That is not my forgiveness to give, and I am not one who could comment on your parenting. All either of us can do is better than before." Izuku looked up at his father. It was strange to hear him talk about things like that. "That being said, I do have access to a great many very capable, very expensive, very ruthless investigators and lawyers, in case your son ever as much as looks at Izuku in a way either of us doesn't like," the man continued. That was more like what Izuku expected. "I understand," Mitsuki said, visibly tenser than before. "If there is anything else I can do, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you for your offer, but you have already done enough." "Izuku, did you finish packing yet?" "Almost. I just need to grab a couple more things." "Then you should do that. You said you wanted away from here." Izuku nodded and headed back inside. He got the suitcases from next to the staircase and pulled out additional clothes from the hallway cabinet. He shoved some shoes in the suitcases and, as an afterthought, stepped in the kitchen to inhale the rest of the tea. In a few minutes, he was back at the door and turned off the last light. Mitsuki, too, had slipped her coat on and stepped out. "We'll be going now," Izuku's father said. He grabbed a suitcase with one hand and Izuku's shoulder with other. They walked to a large black car with tinted windows in front of the house. Mitsuki followed a few steps behind, but they loaded the luggage and entered to the back seat without a word. Inside, Izuku noticed Kurogiri in his human form on the driver's seat. As the car started moving, he took one more glance at the house he had lived in since birth, thinking briefly about all the now painful memories inside it. When it disappeared from his field of view, he felt he would never return. Chapter 6. What now? Izuku felt both loss and relief as the house disappeared behind a corner. Confused at his own emotions, he stared at the seat in front of him, shoulders sagged. It didn't last long as his father began making strange groans. The sight when Izuku turned made him gasp as his father's face morphed and twisted. The healthy skin and eyes lost their color and smoothness before shrinking into his head, leaving behind only the usual wrinkled and scarred skin. His father pulled down his collar that had helped hide the pipe hanging from his throat, attached to something small enough to hide under the jacket. He reached under the seat and pulled out the collar part of his helmet with its breathing mask attached. With the mask on, he drew a deep breath a few times with an audible hiss. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked. "Yes," his father answered. "I had to abandon most of my breathing aids to hide my state even with that shape-shifting quirk. My oxygen levels would have dropped a bit." He chuckled. "Haven't I become pathetic, unable to even breathe on my own?" "No," Izuku blurted out. "You've guarded me even when I didn't know it, saved me, healed me, and even taught me about my quirks. You too, Kurogiri. None of that sounds pathetic to me. At least I can still impress my son. Hopefully that means I can offer comfort too. First, you should know that you don't need to worry about anything practical. I have started arranging things so you can live well and as normally as you want, though even now I cannot be present in your life as much as Inko was." Izuku nodded gratefully, but the mention of his mother brought tears back to his eyes. His father brought his arm over Izuku's shoulder and pulled him closer. The next moment the car was a lot darker, and they were in some large windowless garage. Izuku glanced at Kurogiri, who was already stepping out. Izuku followed and did not need to be told to step into a warp gate that appeared in front of him. In an instant he was back in the luxurious apartment of the previous day, where he had been as... Izuku choked a little, barely able to breathe as tears began flowing again. Only his father and Kurogiri were there. There was no one to confront, nothing to hide, nowhere to go, and nothing that needed doing. For the first time he could just collapse. Kurogiri's misty form barely caught him as he did so literally. The mist felt soft and warm as it lifted him to a sofa. The sofa shifted a bit, followed by a familiar hand landing on Izuku's shoulder. No one said anything for a long time as Izuku thoroughly soaked the fine leather. Eventually he was too out of breath to cry and too dehydrated to produce any more tears, so he could only stare at the opposite window as his vision slowly returned to normal. He gasped, trying to take back control of his lungs. "Perhaps we should get a breathing machine for you too," his father said. Izuku tried to chuckle, but it hurt. Father continued, "I am glad that worked. Comforting in a situation like this is not among my strengths." Slowly Izuku sat up and stared at the floor. As he spoke, it was barely a whisper. "She's really gone." "Yes," his father confirmed. "They didn't even try to stop him. They just watched her die." "The heroes?" I don't think I can call them that," Izuku said. His father pulled him closer. "Here, that is okay. You have lost so much because of those who are called heroes. We both have." They sat there in silence for some time before Izuku raised his head and looked at his father's mostly missing face. "Dad, how did you get your injuries? You really shouldn't worry about that now. I need to know. I have wanted to ask for a while, but it's what kept you from even visiting us, right? Maybe, without that we could have all been together yesterday." And there was a pause of silence before his father spoke. "All Might," he said slowly. "He destroyed much of what I had built until we inevitably faced each other head-on. It was the hardest battle I have ever experienced, and he only stopped once he thought I was dead. If it wasn't for the injuries I was able to inflict on him, he might have stayed to make sure the job was finished." After his father answered, Izuku looked away. "Heroes are supposed to capture villains, not? That only applies as long as it is convenient for the heroes and those in charge," his father interrupted Izuku. "It isn't even a secret if you think about it. The most popular heroes and those most expected to become heroes are those with flashy physical powers that are best suited to injure or kill, while people with mental or supportive quirks are lucky to become heroes at all, even when better suited at solving situations without violence. You have already seen this with Katsuki Bakugo. Besides All Might, even the number 2 hero's power is, above all else, best suited for maiming or killing people in one of the most painful ways possible. If someone considered a villain, anyone without a card declaring them a hero, burned people half as bad as he has done for even small-time villains, that person would go to Tartarus without a question. Izuku thought about his father's words. He was too shaken and winded to even begin muttering. Kurogiri quietly placed a bowl of katsudon in front of him. Realizing how late it was, gratefully Izuku took the bowl. After the first taste, he started eating at an increasing speed, showing more energy than any time earlier that day. The instant he finished, Kurogiri was there to switch the katsudon bowl with a bowl of ice cream. Izuku nearly started crying again at the Nomu's kindness, while his father never left the sofa. After the lunch, Kurogiri disappeared somewhere, leaving the two alone. Eventually, Izuku was able to ask the one question he needed an answer to most. "Dad," he began. "What's going to happen now? Are we going to live here?" "No, this place is under another name, but don't worry. Hisashi Midoriya is about to buy a nice house near a very good school. The rest will depend on what you want. You can live there in peace, go to school and continue with your life as is. I will finance your living as I have till now and keep in contact occasionally, but I cannot be present in a way that would risk involving you in my business. It would be an ordinary, possibly lonely at first, but a safe live. That is what Inko would prefer." The last part was a strong argument in Izuku's mind, but going back to almost no contact with his father hurt to just think about. What is the other option? "You will enter my life. We will be father and son, but only out of sight. You will know more of what I do, and most likely get involved with it sooner or later depending on your choices. I should warn you, this is the more dangerous option. It would make you a villain both legally and in public opinion if our relationship was ever exposed, and that isn't necessarily the most dangerous part. We would have to spend much time together just to train you, so you could protect yourself when myself or Kurogiri aren't present. You would still live in the house and go to school. So those are my choices," Izuku said, looking down in deep thought. "Yes, details might be flexible to a point, but those are the two paths in front of you. Well, you could always decide you don't want to be involved with me at all. There are already bank accounts under your name, so you won't be left empty-handed if you want to walk away." "No," Izuku blurted out as his head bounced up. The two options had forced him to really think about them, but the third, he was physically unable to even consider it. He hadn't even thought about money. His father and Kurogiri were everything he cared about that he still had left. As that thought hit him, his arms snaked around his father's and held onto it like the man would disappear otherwise. He had made his decision. "People already call me a villain. I would rather be a villain with you than continue being treated like one alone. You should know that I am a harsh trainer. You will need my healing quirks many times." Izuku gulped. "I told you. It will be a dangerous life. If I need to be harsh to keep you alive, I will. Do you think you will be up to it?" "Yes," Izuku responded. "There was a time when I wanted to become a pro hero, back when I was still quirkless. If I was going to train and do what that would take, I should survive getting proper training with one. Very well. We will start with the quirks you took. Considering your past experiences, it will be easier if you present one of them as your quirk at your new school. It will probably help. Even if someone is nice, it wouldn't be for the real me. You have a few days to choose how you want to do it. It will take at least that long to arrange your transfer and prepare the house. Can I ask where you are sending me? Not that anywhere wouldn't be better than Aldera. Of course. I am arranging for you to attend Somei Private Academy for rest of the year." "Somei," Izuku mumbled. "Isn't it?" "Prestigious, expensive, and selective," his father answered. "After being absent for so long, how could I offer you anything but the best? I would ask how you can pull off an admittance to such a school, but I could just as well ask how you got this apartment. In time, perhaps. Now, you need something to focus your attention on before crying again. Would you like to continue practicing with the quirks? Whatever you choose, you will need to make them yours." "Yeah," Izuku said, and a memory hit him. "Yesterday I destroyed all my All Might stuff with it. I won't complain about that. No, I mean..." Izuku brought his arm up and made the dragon blade appear. "When I was using it, it changed somehow. One moment it just burns without really cutting like when you taught me to control it, then suddenly it felt completely different. I was carving out the wall behind the shelves I wanted to destroy, and it felt easy like I could have cut through a lot more. But to do that, it would need to be thinner, but that alone wouldn't. Interesting. Either there is more to that quirk than we thought, his father said, making Izuku pause his muttering, or you are already well ahead of my lessons. What do you mean? Didn't I tell you yesterday that I would teach you how to combine and use multiple quirks simultaneously? The other quirk you got was a form of vibration quirk. It may appear simple on the surface, but the simplest quirks often make for the most powerful combinations by altering effects of other quirks. For example, I have a quirk called spring-like limbs. On its own, it can give me slight enhancements to agility and force of my punches, as well as the ability to absorb impacts. But combined with other quirks, it allows me to push their power past the limits that my body could not handle otherwise. For you, the application of high-speed vibration could explain enhanced cutting ability. What I am surprised by is that you could achieve simultaneous use so soon without even intending it. That is amazing. Izuku's eyes widened, and for the first time that day, it was not to cry. Most quirks have weaknesses or side effects, but if another quirk can counter that, I'll have to rewrite all of my quirk notes. Strength quirk with body hardening quirk, or maybe flight. Water quirk could help focus electricity better than most of them can, or maybe. Then again, his father interrupted Izuku's muttering again. Maybe I should not be surprised. If Kurogiri is right, you are a bigger quirk nerd than myself. He smiled to Izuku behind his breathing mask. Enough talk, would you like to try it right now? Yes, Izuku said with a smile of his own. Not even close to the widest it could have been, but the distraction was welcome. He needed something to do, and training with his dad sounded like just the thing. Chapter 7. A New Life Begins. Hello, my name is Izuku Midoriya. I am joining your class for rest of the year, Izuku said and bowed slightly to the classroom of students. Bowing let him draw a few deep breaths without it being noticed. It felt uncanny to walk through the school without anyone avoiding or scowling at him, but he was still on edge, ready to be ostracized over even a single wrong move. Finishing his bow, he gathered enough courage to get up and face his new classmates again. Midoriya has transferred to us from Aldera Junior High from Mustafa City starting today, the teacher said. Please make him feel welcome. Now, does anyone have any questions, including you, Midoriya? Several of the students had their hands up before she finished talking. She pointed at a girl in the back of the room.
Nori.
What is your quirk? Izuku gulped. Of course, they would ask that first. What else about him could people possibly care about? If he had any doubts before they were gone now. He held his hand up, the palm towards himself. Fire burst over the back of his hand, and Izuku applied vibration to it as the blade stretched and thinned down. It still took too much focus to be practical in a fight, but at least Izuku could combine the quirks reliably for a while. He pushed his limits to make the blade as long and impressive as he could for the brief moment. Most people in the class were wide-eyed. Some made positive remarks about how cool his quirk was, not knowing how that wrenched Izuku inside. Izuku stopped before the teacher could comment on using quirks at school. Instead, she pointed at another student for a question. Why did you transfer suddenly, and how did you even get in this school? Maybe there were worse questions than his quirk. This time Izuku couldn't completely hide his reaction. Is everything okay? The teacher asked.
Yes.
I transferred because Izuku paused as the words stuck to his throat as if they were trying to choke him. My mother was killed recently and, well, you don't need to talk about anything you don't want to, the teacher said. And no one will pressure you if they know what is best for them. Now, let's start the lesson. You can get to know each other better during breaks. Thank you, Izuku whispered as he walked past her to the only free seat. On the second row behind tall blue-haired kid with eyeglasses. No one tried to pull their desks away or lean away from him. It would have been nice if it wasn't all based on a lie. He didn't dare to look anywhere but the teacher and his own desk as the lesson commenced. At least she actually taught him too. The first few classes passed uneventfully. Izuku was used to getting from class to class with minimal contact with others and didn't think to do anything else. He was also distracted by the school itself. His old school had been, decent in teaching for people that had good or commonplace quirks, just reputable enough that mother had not gone out of her way to send Izuku to a better school further away. The school, however, had not been exceptional in any way, and the buildings had been average at best. Some, on the other hand, showed the money rich parents had poured into it everywhere. Everything looked new, clean and shiny. Large open halls with high ceilings made the place feel more like a monument than a junior high school. The morning lessons soon finished, and he was about to slip away for lunch when, "You, Izuku Midoriya." Izuku froze in place and turned around a few seconds later. It was the blue-haired boy. So far, Izuku only knew that he seemed to be very formal and often quite loud. He walked towards Midoriya, waving his arms like a robot from an ancient sci-fi film. "My name is Tinya Ida. Are you intentionally trying to avoid interacting with the class? We should all seek to improve both ourselves and each other, and isolating yourself will hold everyone back." Wah. Izuku was genuinely flustered for the first time in a while. This guy actually had a problem with him keeping his distance and not the other way around. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't think anyone would feel that way. Usually people are happy that I stay out of their way." "Why?" Ida started and stopped mid-sentence. Izuku could see gears turning in his head with realization in his eyes. "Would you like to join us for lunch at least?" The request almost made Izuku tear up from joy, but even then, a nagging voice in his head kept saying Ida was only nice because Izuku had lied about his quirk. He still smiled slightly. "I'd love to." "Excellent," Ida responded. "The cafeteria is this way. Also, your tie is not straight. It shows disrespect to this prestigious school." Izuku brought his hand to the tie that was part of the Somei school uniform. He was surprised at the other boy's sudden critique, but he didn't seem to be condemning Izuku, even if Izuku couldn't help but feel annoyed at the irrelevant complaint. He followed Ida to the cafeteria and to the line for food. Some of their classmates were already there. "Hey, it's the new kid. Did Ida already chew you out for something?" "So he does that often?" Izuku asked. The others snickered. "Every single day. I merely wish everyone would give the school the respect it desires," Ida defended himself, waving his arms again. He got some laughs from the other students, but they lacked the sharp mockery Izuku was used to hearing in people's laughs. The group dragged Izuku with them to a large table full of their classmates. Izuku had never been with so many positive and neutral expressions. "Hey, it's the fire hand." "Huh?" Izuku stared at the girl that had said that. "She's talking about your quirk," another said. "You didn't yet tell us what it's called." "Oh, right," Izuku responded. Of course they were talking about his quirk. "I call it Dragon Blade. It's a pretty simple flame quirk, but if I focus hard enough, it can cut really well in addition to burning. It isn't that useful really, but people seem to think it's cool." "It is," the first girl said. Others expressed their agreement. "Hey, how?" Another student started asking, but was interrupted when Ida stood up and started waving his arms again. "Remember what the teacher said? Do not push Midoriya to answer questions he doesn't want to talk about. Chill out, Ida. I wasn't going to ask about that. Just wondered what his old school was like." Very biased and more interested in gaining prestige for the school than actually teaching its students, all of its students, Izuku said, feeling a sudden need to vent about something he didn't need to keep secret. "What does that mean?" Izuku turned to look at his new classmate over the table. His stare was empty with tenseness on his face from anger. "I was considered quirkless until I was 13 years old. My childhood best friend got a flashy quirk that could easily hurt people. One of us could do almost anything, hurt anyone, and people would still talk about how he is going to be a hero in the future. The other could have just as well been invisible, and could get almost anything done to him without consequences. Would you like to guess which was me?" He turned to look at the girl who had asked about his quirk in class. "I hope things might be different here, but guess what was the first thing you wanted to know about me?" That startled most of the group. Several looked surprised. A few, too few, appeared angry at what they had learned. Some didn't really react, or they looked annoyed. The person Izuku had been talking to moved to that group after initial surprise. "Well, it's not like quirkless people could do as much as regular people. Of course, a school would focus on making sure that someone more capable has a chance to become something. You should just be glad you got a quirk. Izuku sighed and stood up. This is why I didn't bother transferring anywhere else before. People are the same garbage everywhere. It's the truth. Quirkless people are just less advanced than the rest of us. It's simple evolution. You wouldn't talk like that if you were quirkless for a while, Izuku said as he took his food and turned to leave. The quirkless probably dream about that being possible, but you just can't change a person like that. It would be like turning a quirkless human into a chimpanzee. Izuku squeezed the food tray, struggling to not make a remark that would make his situation worse. These people definitely would not accept his real quirk. He walked away, finding a corner table which occupants had just left, leaving the entire table empty. He was used to eating alone. At least people didn't go out of their way to get away from him. He stopped eating to look at his palm. The hole was barely covered by special tape and makeup. For the first time ever, he wanted to use his quirk on someone, and he didn't even regret the thought. If he hadn't chosen to fake his real quirk, he sighed and put his hand down. It would just have been worse if he did tell the truth. At least there had been some that reacted negatively to hearing how he had been treated as quirkless. Izuku didn't dare to risk approaching any of them, and the rest of the day passed with him keeping even more distance from others. In the end, Izuku left school with his shoulders sagging and eyes on the asphalt. You should carry yourself more respectably, especially in our school's uniform. Izuku turned his head to give Ida a tired look. He wasn't sure how to feel about the taller boy. Their main interactions had been Ida complaining about stupid things, but he had been the first one to at least try to approach Izuku in a friendly manner, and had seemed surprised, shocked even, when Izuku exposed his quirkless past. I carry myself as I feel, Izuku responded. And if the school has a problem with it, that's just more reason to feel this way. Yes, I am sorry for how our classmates acted. Even after 2 years, I did not realize how serious the views are that some of them hold. There has never been a quirkless person in our class. And what would you have done if there was? That would depend on the person. I think everyone should be treated equally unless their actions demand otherwise. Are you sure about that? Izuku said. His voice started getting some venom along the tiredness. You would do that even if it meant being ostracized just like the useless, less-than-human quirkless kid? Ida didn't say anything. I thought so. I was a fool to think that an elite school would be any better. It's easier to look down to people the higher you are in this quirk society and to ignore the flaws of those on your level. Being from a whole family of heroes, you wouldn't question the darker sides of the hero society whether you see it or not. I wouldn't. Wait, how do you know about my family? I never told you about them. The most important thing for a hero in this society is their fame and popularity over all else. Ida family, and especially Ingenium nowadays, aren't exactly unknown. Right, I accept your explanation. They kept walking in the same direction in silence, but Izuku could feel Ida's eyes on his back. Eventually, the taller boy couldn't hold things in anymore. I must ask, do you have something against heroes? Not the concept of a hero, Izuku answered after a moment. I just don't think there are as many actual heroes as people think. The official title is meaningless, just a way to control who can use quirks. If anything, it stops more people from acting heroically. Not to mention the whole profession is the top example of how people are valued by their quirks, and not even their real usefulness, but how heroic the society decides they are. I shouldn't need to explain after today's lunch. Another period of silence followed. Izuku glanced at Ida. Are you following me, or? He asked. Ida stopped for an instant and raised his hands up defensively. Oh no, I am going home. Seems we just happen to live in the same direction. Izuku looked at him for a moment. I believe you. If nothing else, I get the feeling you aren't the lying type. Thank you. Well, I guess we'll see each other again tomorrow, Izuku said and turned into a yard. They had walked up a green hill and now on a ledge with an excellent view, he entered the lush yard of a new 2-story building, large enough for a family of 10. He cringed as Ida stared at the building. Why did father have to do everything so big? Izuku walked a bit faster to get inside quicker. He had not even slept in the house so far, having only made sure all his things were there. Unfortunately, it had been up to him to sort out his mother's things and what to do with them. Half of the stuff stored in one of the many rooms would probably get moldy after being soaked by his tears. Checking the time, he changed out of his school clothes and headed to the basement. His father had arranged for it to be made into a fully equipped gym and spa. Izuku had a feeling he would be expected to spend plenty of time there. The spa was nice, though. He had about 30 minutes for warm-up and stretching before a familiar dark mist poured out of thin air. Izuku had a wide, genuine smile on his face as Kurogiri's misty form stepped through the warp gate. Chapter 8. A Villain in Training. Izuku stepped out of Kurogiri's warp gate still smiling. The Nomu himself followed through and moved to Izuku's father's side. They were in a large industrial-feeling room, probably some form of a warehouse. It was dimly lit like the medical room Izuku had first met his father in before. It might well have been the same building. A loud thump took his attention as a large, somewhat human-like creature stepped out of the darkness behind his father. It was taller than anyone else in the room, with a muscular body, a grayish skin, and it had its brains visible on the outside of its skull. Dad, is that a Nomu? Kurogiri isn't the only one? Yes. I am glad you remember my earlier explanation. That saves time, though you should know that this Nomu is mindless, essentially a walking corpse or a biological robot. Who did you use to make it? Izuku asked. Don't you recognize him? Izuku could hear the smirk in his father's voice. Then again, he did give you brain damage. A fuzzy image of the original owner of the vibration quirk flashed in Izuku's memory along with his last screams of terror as the man was engulfed by Kurogiri's mist. You saw me kill one of them. Did you think I would spare others after what they did? Kurogiri could have killed them, but deemed this a better punishment, and I agreed. This way they can pay you back by serving you. Izuku breathed in deep. He knowingly chose this life, and the man had earned this fate. When Izuku was in their hands, he had heard them talk about having killed other people before. They were murderers. They deserved this. Why is it here? He asked. For your training, of course. The first phase of your training will be to strengthen your body, skills, and quirk until you can defeat this type of Nomu reliably. It is a low-tier Nomu, but if you can defeat it, you can easily do the same to street thugs like those that kidnapped you, and even low-level or non-combat-oriented pro-heroes. If you plan to exist in my world, this is the absolute minimum you have to be able to handle, regardless of what you choose to do. I know, Izuku said as he stared at the Nomu towering over him. I don't want to be that helpless again. You should also know that I am much harsher as a trainer than as a father. The smirk had disappeared from his father's face and voice. For the first time since Izuku had learned who the man was, he was feeling like he was talking to the dangerous villain all for one rather than just his long-missed father. What should I do? Izuku asked. We will start by seeing what you can do now. Fight and try to kill the Nomu. Use everything you know and all of your quirks the best you can. He paused for a moment as Izuku processed the instructions. Nomu, attack. The creature screeched in an ear-shattering high pitch and charged. Izuku barely jumped out of the way but didn't exactly land graciously. He yelped as his arms hit the hard floor. Nomu, stop, all for one commanded. Izuku, get up. Izuku scrambled to get up, holding his wrists that took the worst of the fall. He winced. I hope you won't be slowed down by that amount of pain. You don't want to be helpless like when you were kidnapped, like your mother was. Izuku's head snapped, and he stared at all for one like even All Might wouldn't dare. Yes, let the anger flow through you. If it helps you get stronger, it is good. Your reaction speed was good, faster than I expected, but it is no use unless you know how to take advantage of it instinctually. If you dodge, you must stay mobile after the initial motion and counterattack, not become a child who slipped and needs daddy to help with the boo-boo. Izuku gritted his teeth. We are going to do this again, All for One said. Try to stay on your feet this time and use your vibrating blade. You should be able to evade and attack at the same time with your quirks. Nomu, attack. It wasn't the last time Izuku met the floor during the hour that All for One repeatedly sent the Nomu after him. In the end, gasping, Izuku was held against the wall by the Nomu, his arms held above his head, full of bruises and scabs. The Nomu had a burnt cut on its arm, but that didn't seem to even slow it, and the wound was already closing at a visible speed. "I think that is enough testing," his father said, his tone back to normal. "There is much to do." Kurogyri. A warp gate opened under Izuku's legs, and the mindless Nomu lowered him into it. Izuku welcomed the familiar feeling of the mist flowing along his legs. His feet hit something soft, and he laid in a half-sitting position on a familiar hospital bed. His father and Kurogyri stepped through another warp gate. Kurogyri reached into a third smaller one and pulled out a bottle of cold water. He handed it to Izuku. "Thank you." As he drank, his father sprayed something onto the scabs on his legs before using a quirk to make them close properly. "Are you feeling ill in any way or feeling pain other than from your bruises?" he asked, sounding like a completely different person than he had been the past hour. All for One had done his job for the day, and Izuku's father was back. Izuku smiled. "My right wrist. It has hurt to move since the third time I hit the floor." His father simply grabbed the wrist, held it straight, causing a little pain. With a green glow, all of the pain was soon gone. That quirk, or quirks, were really efficient. Most healing quirks drain stamina, but Izuku didn't feel drained by the treatment at all. Then again, his injuries were minor, and father had once mentioned that the healing works better when he was more rested. Izuku started muttering about healing quirks under his breath even as his injuries were healing. "You truly inherited my interest in quirks," his father said. "It is very useful, especially with our quirk." "Yes," Izuku said. "There is one thing I don't understand. If you have such a good healing quirk, or quirks, why are you still so injured, deformed, barely alive?" He finished the question. Izuku nodded. "While my healing quirks are powerful, there are limits to what they can do, and they do not work passively. I was only saved by a different quirk that allowed my memories to be stored in my spine before All Might crushed my head." Izuku squeezed his hands into fists, being reminded of what had happened to his father and by whom. "That let my consciousness survive until the doctor got to me and reassembled my skull with surgery and other healing quirk users, but it could only work to a point. We did not possess any quirks that could reverse such total damage. I still require regular treatment, but that is more to maintain my current condition rather than heal anything further. We recently acquired a more powerful super regeneration quirk, but it is a blunt tool, excellent if you already have it in battle, but unable to affect wounds that have already closed. So, there is no way to?" The doctor is still researching possibilities, but so far there is only one way that isn't more likely to kill me in the process. I need to combine my other healing quirks with one for all. One for, Izuku started. "Is it a quirk related to All for One?" His father nodded slowly. When he spoke, he didn't seem to focus on anything in the room. His voice was best described as nostalgic. "It is a generational stockpiling enhancing quirk I accidentally created in my little brother. I believed he was quirkless and gave him a power stockpiling quirk that I thought might help his weak body. Only later we found out he already had a quirk. It was a very much useless ability to transfer itself to another person and nothing more, as far as I know. Somehow the quirks fused into one, something that took the doctor a century to replicate artificially in Kurogyri. I doubt I need to explain to you what combining those two powers means." Izuku was already thinking. He rubbed his chin with a now fully healed hand and started muttering to himself. "A quirk to stockpile power and quirk to transfer itself. Generational stockpiling enhancing quirk. Normal limits of quirks, human lifespan. Passing on the quirk itself, not just inheriting genes." Izuku's eyes widened. "Does the quirk also transfer the power it has already gathered?" "Yes, and it has already been wielded by 8 different people for more than a century. Accumulation-type quirks that can constantly grow rather than just needing a charge time to use have much more potential than more stagnant quirks, theoretically unlimited potential if they weren't limited by effects of aging and human lifespan. If this quirk can bypass that and be passed on faster than normal human generations," Izuku stopped mid-sentence. "By now a quirk like that could make its holder one of, if not the most powerful person in the world." "You could say so," his father said. One for All is currently possessed by All Might. Izuku stared at his father for a moment, but it did make sense. He gestured at his father's head and mask. So, he did this to you with a power you created. Yes, though the only surprising thing was that he won. My younger brother did not share my visions or ways of getting there. He used One for All to try and fight me, and everyone that has inherited the quirk since has continued the fight. I believe there was one who disappeared for several years, until someone else appeared with the quirk. I have tried to take it many times, but it is the only quirk that has been able to resist my All for One. You couldn't take it? Izuku asked, surprised. No, so far it can only be passed on willingly. In hindsight, it would have been better to just kill one of them and end the quirk, but I wanted it. I have wanted it since I realized what I had created. So even though they all have sought to kill me, I had to let each of them pass the quirk forward in the hope I could one day take it. But I was careless, and while All Might was hiding in the United States, I got tired. I no longer ruled Japan and the Hero Society was already rising, but my underground empire was still vast and stable. After a century of fighting and plotting, I started questioning my way of life. I had already created new identities to act as covers and took a step back from my organization to try something different, a vacation of sorts to rest before All Might would return. Then I met Inko. How did you meet? Izuku asked, holding back tears from the mere mention of his mother. We accidentally bumped into each other at a cafe. She was so flustered and apologized repeatedly, as if it was some serious situation. I thought it was stupid for an adult, but something about her was endearing. I had never spent time with someone like her as a villain. I asked if she would like to sit down with me. One thing led to another, and you were born 2 years later. He paused and ruffled Izuku's hair like no one else had ever done. I still took business trips, but most of the time, I could enjoy regular family life for the first time since my own childhood, and those weren't peaceful times. Some days I even imagined putting my ideals aside to stay like that, at least until you grew up. What would 18 or 20 years be for a struggle longer than a century? Unfortunately, All Might returned to Japan while Inko was pregnant with you. I had to split my time with you too, and one other while trying to maintain what I had built. But in the end, it took all my time to hold him back, and Inko started getting suspicious. I came up with the working abroad lie. Then my fight with All Might happened. He finished healing Izuku's injuries, even the smallest bruises. He helped Izuku sit up on the edge of the bed and sat down next to him. After that, I decided it was best for both of you, easiest for everyone if I just stayed away. You were wrong, Izuku said quietly, looking down. It wasn't easy. You made it quite clear the day all three of us were in this room. Father paused. Now it's too late. It is for Mom, Izuku said and leaned against his father. You're still here. I don't care what you look like. Never did. His father chuckled and pulled him closer. How did a villain like me earn a son like you? Perhaps I should then act like a father. How was your first school day? Izuku stiffened. Somehow, he hadn't expected that question. It was fine. Do not lie to me, his father said with a stern, threatening voice. Izuku shivered hearing it. While I loved Inko, I know she was a bit gullible. Don't think you can pretend in front of me like you did with her. Promise you won't let Kurogiri go to the school, Izuku pleaded, getting only a nod in response. The Nomu in question remained quiet and motionless, but his glowing eyes were focused on Izuku. I pretended that the Dragon Blade is my quirk, but when they asked about my old school, I admitted to being a late bloomer and what that meant. I don't think they are all the same, but some of them are pretty bad. Talking about evolution and comparing quirkless people to chimpanzees. I have never actually wanted to take someone's quirk before, but today, I would not fault you, but that would cause problems. So unless you want them to experience a sudden accident.
No.
Izuku blurted out. I just need to figure out who are the decent people, if there are any. Have you noticed anyone specific yet? Maybe one. He criticized people about little things and comes from a hero family, but it's impossible to know how he would be in a different situation. He still felt like a decent person besides the annoying strictness. At least he criticized my actions, not what I am. He somehow got me to talk about how I feel about heroes on the walk home. He didn't judge me for it. Maybe he was just surprised. A hero family, you say? His father asked. Ingenium's brother. His father was silent for a moment. Izuku couldn't read the expressions on his missing face and started getting nervous. Eventually his father got up. Not the worst of them. I won't involve myself with whatever you want to do with him. Just remember, he would still want to destroy us if he knew about me. So be careful. Even if your quirk is exposed, claim it is just a random mutation you hid to prevent bullying. If anyone asks, tell them your father breathes fire. Of course, Izuku said and followed his father, getting off the bed. Thanks for being a dad, I guess. Mom always asked how I did in school. I always lied. Maybe if I didn't, she would have. Something impacted Izuku's cheek with enough force to yank his head a bit to the side, air flowing past his head. After blinking a couple of times, he saw his father had his hand up, palm towards Izuku. Don't start blaming yourself for what-ifs. Nothing good comes out of it, and once you start it is difficult to stop. I know. Izuku rubbed his cheek and looked at the floor. It is still true. This time Izuku saw the air blast coming early enough to flinch, but it wasn't enough to evade it. Dad, I told you not to do that. If you want a father in your life, that includes disciplining you when needed. Is that your idea of disciplining? Izuku asked, shocked. Actually, it is part of your training, but works for both. I warned I would be harsh. This quirk is called air cannon. I held back most of its power, so it won't cause serious injury, but its speed makes it excellent for training. Izuku stared at his father, but it was impossible to win a staring competition with an eyeless man. In the end, Izuku could only pout. His victorious father continued talking about training. Your main limitations in the fight were skill, speed, and agility, both in evasion and attack. Strength isn't such a concern when you're using the vibrating dragon blade, which is the only combination you can use without raising unwanted questions. Unless an enemy has a powerful defensive quirk, you will be able to cut them. However, the quirk is useless if you get crushed by a stronger, faster opponent before you can use it, or if you cannot hit the enemy at all. In the worst case, you could be killed before even being able to fight back if you were targeted. Do you understand? Yes, Izuku answered. Good. Your training will have 3 parts. You will follow a physical training regimen on your own to make sure your body is capable and healthy. I will help you control your quirks, all of them, and monitor combat trainings with Nomus as often as I can. I want you to be always alert even outside training, so I will use the air cannon anytime we are together. You must be able to evade sudden attacks also outside of training sessions. That is the only way for you to be as safe as possible. That's why you are so harsh, right? Yes, his father answered and put his hand on Izuku's shoulder. I will also have the doctor provide you a copy of the super regeneration quirk a bit later. It is very powerful, so we should wait longer for your body to adjust to holding your current quirks. You need to learn control in the meanwhile. We'll do that after your combat training sessions. So, Izuku started, now? His father smiled behind his mask. Very good. Chapter 9. Izuku Shigaraki. Izuku yawned, leaned his head sideways and rotated his shoulder, still sore from his morning and evening gym training. He'd have to check the instructions on the stretches again. He wasn't excited about feeling like this all day every day, but his father really wanted him to get fit soon so random criminals couldn't just grab him like they had that one time. With his studies and all the other training, he didn't have much free time left, but he was sure he could squeeze in more training than his father's plan required. He counted hours in his head and scribbled notes on his notebook, trying to figure what would be the most efficient use of his time. Father wanted him to improve his agility, so Izuku started wondering what would help with that most. Midoriya. Ida stood up and turned to face Izuku, waving his arm. You have been muttering the whole lesson. Stop that. It is distracting others, and you should focus on the lesson yourself. That is enough, Ida, the teacher commanded. Midoriya, focus on the lesson. I don't know how your old school did things, but here we don't think about other things in class. In my old school that was dependent on a person's quirk, Izuku answered, wondering how long they would keep treating him as the new guy. He had transferred months ago. The lesson, Midoriya. Focus on it. Izuku shut up and focused on his notebook, the one with notes for the class. They were studying history and had just reached the point where people started being born with quirks. Now, the teacher continued, as part of your grade, you will do group presentations for the societal consequences of quirks appearing. I will assign the groups. Izuku wanted to smirk. They were literally talking about his father's childhood. The only problem was explaining to his group where he found the information. Team 3, Tenya Ida, Izuku Midoriya, and Nori Uehara. Izuku's face froze, staring forward when the last name was declared. It was bad enough to be in the same class with the girl that would have compared him to a chimpanzee just a year earlier. The idea of having to work with her made him think about his father's mention of a sudden accident. His hand shot up. You don't get to change your group, Midoriya. Here we expect everyone to be able to work with everyone. Your topic will be the rise of organized villainy and the so-called emperor of villains who nearly ruled Japan. Izuku would have fallen off his seat if he wasn't still so focused on who he needed to work with. A chair scraped against the floor as Uehara joined him and Ida. They stayed quiet until the teacher finished assigning groups and let them work for the rest of the lesson. Uehara was the first to speak. So, has either of you ever heard about this so-called emperor of villains? I have read about a villain that created an army of followers when the societal order collapsed. I don't think his name was mentioned anywhere, Ida commented. That is because he only used the name of his quirk, Izuku said, speaking only to Ida, unwilling to even look at the third member of their group. It was called All for One. How do you know that? Uehara asked, sounding like she didn't believe him. I have a bookshelf full of notebooks on different quirks. And you complained about valuing quirks. Uehara raised her nose and managed a grin so arrogant Bakugo would have been left second. Being interested in quirks and valuing people based on their quirks are two different things. One gives you knowledge. The other just makes you a trash person, Izuku recited in tired tone. Remember when you said that it is impossible to make a person quirkless? Yeah, the whole idea is ridiculous. Not exactly, Izuku said, finally meeting the girl's gaze. He had to choose his words carefully. There are a lot of inconsistencies with any sources on All for One, but most sources from the time claim he could take and give away people's quirks. Many of people followed him because he either gave them quirks or took away ones they didn't want. Must have been pretty dumb people to have given their quirks away, Uehara said. Just because you only care about people if they have quirks doesn't mean everyone else does. And some quirks aren't any better than being quirkless even today, Izuku said. He was squeezing his hand into a fist under his desk. Especially back then when quirks were relatively rare. Imagine having a mutant quirk or hard-to-control quirk with side effects when people with quirks were seen as you see quirkless people. Fine, you're right. Being a mutant quirked freak isn't that much better than quirkless. So, do you think Ida is a freak since he has a mutant quirk? Izuku shot back. How many people does this class actually have that you don't think lesser of because of their quirks? Izuku had never even raised his voice, but the people closest to them were already stopping their own discussions to listen in. It's not like they are quirkless, Uehara bypassed the mutant question. Some of us just have better quirks. You should see it. Uehara, I still don't even know what quirk you have, Izuku deadpanned. He was tired of this and it showed. He couldn't even get emotional at her. I doubt it will help with the assignment, so I don't care either. You too, Ida interrupted. We have an assignment to complete. Can you show us the sources you got that information in? Ida asked. Izuku tensed. Probably. It has been a while since I ran into them. There are a lot of old books of people describing their experiences after quirks appeared. I can look into it after school. Is there anything else you can think of we should look into? Izuku hummed a bit and looked away from his teammates, trying to think of something and remember both things he had heard from his father and what he had actually read. We should consider differences in how people saw these things compared to today. Like today, people talking about that time talk about how many villains there were and call All for One the emperor of villains. But I don't think people at the time really used those terms. The clear heroes and villains system only appeared later. It was more about being vigilantes or criminals or, Izuku paused. Maybe revolutionaries. At that, both Ida and Uehara seemed confused. A lot of people tried to use the chaos to rebuild society the way they thought right. And things now are as they are because of who eventually succeeded at that. I think that would be a more accurate way to describe All for One than the Emperor of Villains. People probably call him that mostly because winners write the history books. That could be an excellent point of view, Ida said, excitedly waving his hand side to side. How did people see villains before the term became common, and how the societal progress led to our current understanding? Yeah, something like that, Izuku said. At least Ida didn't disregard the idea straight away. They mostly focused on the idea of how people viewed things and the structure of the presentation for rest of class. Izuku promised to get more information and got out of the class as fast as he could. It was the last lesson of the day, so he left and only stopped some distance down the street. Soon Ida walked out and started down the same street. He waited until Ida reached him and then matched the taller boy's pace. How do you feel about the idea of looking at the assignment from how people at the time would have seen it? Can you write about it without framing it in as a modern heroes and villains system? Shouldn't we discuss this with the whole group? We are supposed to be able to work in teams no matter what we might think about the other members.
No, Izuku responded.
Excuse me? I've spent too much time surrounded by shit people, Izuku said, looking at the ground. I tried being nice and making friends, tried to ignore them, tried to turn the other cheek. Let them mock and harass and do whatever they wanted without standing up for myself. It doesn't help. I only got away from them when I left. I am too tired of their garbage to ignore it again, pretend it is not important, or work with people like that just because a teacher that has never experienced it says so. Don't you feel anything that she called you a freak? Of course I do, but it is not our place to disrupt the class for personal reasons. Like he hadn't already disrupted the same class. You want to become a hero, right? Izuku asked. Of course. How are you going to stand up for people if you can't even stand up for yourself? If capturing a criminal would disrupt something in someone's life, if it wasn't polite or convenient to do in that situation, would you just let them go? Izuku's words left Ida silent, but Izuku felt like ranting a bit more. Something in Ida made him seem annoying enough to need a reality check, while also feeling like someone that was safe to talk to. Part of Midoriya simply wanted to test him. Ida had been nice. He had only judged Izuku on his actions, but he already knew Izuku had a quirk without knowing what it really was. When Izuku continued, his voice was much quieter. If you aren't going to stand up against what is wrong no matter what, don't become a hero. Someone will die waiting for you to help them. Having family members that are heroes doesn't make you one any more than a hero license does. They kept walking in silence until they reached Izuku's house. Right at the gate, he stopped and sighed. Sorry for venting like that. I'm just too tired of people like her to just take it. I'll try to look up the information for the assignment. He turned his back to Ida to get inside. Midoriya, Ida said, making him stop. What happened to you? Remember the second question people asked me on my first day? What I said before the teacher said I didn't need to. Izuku walked inside without waiting for Ida to remember and leaned against the inside of the door. He really needed to be more careful at what he said. Thinking of that, he was reminded that he needed to find an excuse why he knew about All for One. He glanced at his palm where the little hole was hidden behind the tape and makeup. After a moment, he headed to his room to do his homework in the little time he had reserved for it. Afterwards, he headed down to the gym to prepare for the evening's training. Kurogyri showed up right as he was supposed to, but as Izuku stepped closer, Kurogyri didn't immediately open a portal for him. Young Midoriya, your father has told me to take you somewhere else today. He has decided that it is time for you to meet someone before training. Izuku raised his eyebrow and tensed up slightly. He had not seen many people with his father, just Kurogyri and the doctor who didn't really show himself. If his father was going to introduce him to someone else, he at least trusted Izuku, but what kind of person would this be? I still need to talk with Dad also, he said. Of course, Kurogyri answered and opened a portal. He is receiving treatment but will be in contact with us. Good, Izuku said and stepped through the portal. He looked around as soon as his head left the mist. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but a reasonably decent-looking, though windowless, bar was not that. He quickly focused on the only person that was already in the room, a light blue-haired, pale-skinned man with a freaking human hand on his face. Izuku hoped for the best but got the feeling it was not fake, but a real human hand. The man's mere presence put Izuku on edge in a similar way to facing a Nomu in training. "So, who is this kid Kurogiri?" the man asked in raspy voice. "His name is Izuku Midoriya. Young Midoriya, this is Tamura Shigaraki." The strange man looked down at Izuku, scratching his neck. Even though he had no weapons, Izuku got the feeling of danger from the man. Hello, Izuku said, stuttering for the first time in a while. "I don't like him," Shigaraki rasped and suddenly moved forward, reaching his hand towards Izuku. Thanks to his father's training, Izuku stepped aside to evade the attack in time, but it turned out to be useless as a small mist portal appeared in the path of Shigaraki's arm. Behind the man, his hand appeared from another portal mid-air. It swung in anger and touched one of the bar stools along the brownwood counter. Izuku gulped as the stool turned into dust. One touch from this man and he would be dead, and he couldn't even see if the quirk was active as one could with his dragon blade. "This one is not for you to kill," Kurogiri reprimanded Tamura. "Master would be very angry if you did. Why would Sensei care about some skinny kid?" "That is a very good question." All for one slightly distorted sound came out of nowhere. After a few seconds, Izuku spotted an empty computer screen and speakers. Shigaraki pulled his arm from the dark portal and Kurogiri moved to clean the pile of dust it left behind. Izuku's father continued, "But is that any way to talk to your brother?" "Brother?" Izuku and Shigaraki said at the exact same time and with the same tone. "Izuku," father started, "Tamura is someone I saved as a child shortly before your birth. I may have been more of an occasional sensei than a true father, but he is effectively my adoptive child. Tamura, Izuku is my long-hidden biological son. You two should get along." The two youths stared at the blank computer screen and then each other. Shigaraki started scratching his neck. "You mean there is another Shigaraki?" Shigaraki asked. Izuku blinked, staring at him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Shigaraki is the name I gave him. It is my original name. Midoriya was the identity I created," father explained. "So, my name is made up," Izuku said, surprised with how much the thought stung. "Aren't they all?" "You know what I mean, Dad. Can I at least have the real name, Shigaraki, now?" Izuku asked. It took a while for his father to answer while sure. Tamura kept scratching his neck ever faster. "Here you can, but to the rest of the world you and your father must still be Midoriya." "That's okay." "Sensei, why are you doing this?" Tamura interrupted. "There wasn't supposed to be a player too." "There wasn't, but things changed. Though it is not yet completely sure if Izuku will be a player. There are still choices he needs to make." "So, I will still lead the league?" "Yes, Tamura. The league is yours regardless of his decisions. Depending what Izuku chooses, he can do other things for this family business of ours. I would benefit from a representative to send in my name rather than the league. You two should still work together and help each other." "Fine," Tamura rasped. "What can he even do?" "You mean what my quirk is?" Izuku said, already disappointed. "Quirk, talent, skills, whatever. Can you actually be useful to the sensei, or are you planning to drag us down?" Izuku stared at his adoptive brother for several seconds, and slowly a wide grin spread across his face. Unlike students with supposedly bright futures at every school he had ever gone to, this creepy villain didn't just care about how he happened to be born. "I think we can get along," Izuku said. "You didn't answer my question," Shigaraki complained. "I know a lot about different quirks and what they can do. Dad and Kurogiri are teaching me how to fight, and I inherited Dad's quirk." "Sensei's quirk?" Tamura asked, staring at Izuku without moving for a while. "Yes. I can take other people's quirks, though I have only taken 2, Izuku said. Tamura continued staring at him for a moment and sat down on the closest stool. "So, another boss fight for the heroes?" Probably not." Izuku waved his hands defensively as his smirk turned into an awkward smile. He too sat down a couple stools away from Tamura. Without saying a word, Kurogyari pulled a bottle of cold lemonade from under the counter. It was even Izuku's favorite lemonade. It is yet to be seen. Nevertheless, you will not talk about Izuku to anyone, Tamura, not even within the league, their father said as Izuku sipped the drink. You should let him know what you can do too. I can destroy. I have trained to fight and destroy. My quirk can destroy anything I touch with all 5 fingers, and my goal is to destroy what I hate. Like what? Izuku asked, once more uncertain on how to feel about the man. This whole cursed hero-dependent society where the wrong quirk is enough to destroy your life. Where people walk around smiling, even surrounded by deadly quirks, but abandon people with quirks they randomly choose to fear or just ignore others' plight because they think a hero will come. I want to bring it down and grind it to dust. Maybe we have something in common, Izuku admitted, hesitantly staring at his drink. But what then? Tamura looked at him confused, as far as Izuku could tell with a hand on the man's face. But instead of a clear question, there was just a huh. What are you going to do afterwards if you collapse the society? Do you have a plan or conviction for something? Not that destroying an entire society is something you can just do. Oh, then what would you do? Izuku turned his head to stare forward at the bar's shelves of drinks. After a moment of silence, he decided what to say. I think we feel the same about how this society is, but destroying it wouldn't help anyone unless you can create a better one in its place. Honestly, I have never seriously intended or planned to do anything major to change the world, though spending time with Dad has made me think about it more. I think I would want to change the society, not destroy it, force it to bend if that is what it takes. Maybe it breaks in the process, but even if change needs destruction, it should be to create something better. There is no point destroying for the sake of destruction. It should be a means to an end at least. Tamura started scratching his neck again. Before he could respond or try to disintegrate Izuku again, their father's chuckle came through the speakers. You should listen to your brother, Tamura. You still need to learn how to think more than one step ahead. Whether you manage to destroy what you hate, that alone will not take you forward, or make the League more than a short-lived collection of thugs. Yes, Sensei, Tamura said, his face visibly tense even under the hand. He might have also gritted his teeth together. You should take some time today to get to know each other. Unfortunately, I cannot run your trainings as usual today, Izuku. The doctor wants to run some treatments today. I'll tell him to prepare for yours. You can spar with Tamura if you think you two aren't going to kill each other in the process. It might be Izuku said and fell silent mid-sentence. What do you mean prepare for mine? I told you I would have him prepare a copy of the regeneration for you. Your body should have fully stabilized from your last acquisitions, if you feel you are ready. Regeneration? Tamura asked. You are giving him a quirk like that even though he hasn't yet done anything? Yes. Why?
Yeah.
Because unlike you, his body can adjust to handle it without extensive modifications which the doctor isn't ready to do yet, unless you want to become a Nomu. Izuku should also be better able to suppress the quirk when needed to hide it, at least once I am done with him. His father's tone made Izuku shiver. Tamura stared at the screen for a moment before turning back against the bar counter and gesturing to Kurogyari. He muttered quiet enough that father might not have heard. Definitely a boss battle. Do you want to talk about anything else? Their father asked. Yes, Izuku said quickly, then shrunk a bit, poking the tips of his index fingers against each other. He even looked away, even though he had only been looking at an empty screen. Kurogyari gave Tamura a drink. I was going to ask if you know anywhere where I might find information on, well, you. You need to explain more, my son. We have a history assignment at school. My group has to talk about the Emperor of Villains. Well, that is a name I haven't heard in a while. I thought so. I need to know about those times for the presentation and find sources to explain why I knew about you in the first place. Sounds like you have been careless, TSK. Somehow Izuku managed to shrink even further on the stool. His father hadn't reprimanded him like that before. Early-level boss, Tamura muttered. Chapter 10. A new villain is born. Liquid dropped around Izuku, leaving his skin sticky as he was pulled up from the tank. As soon as his feet touched the floor, they gave up, and he collapsed on his knees. He was shaking and breathing hard in his oxygen mask. "Doctor?" His father's voice sounded somewhere nearby. Minor state of shock and residual pain. Unsurprising since he is still fully human and the quirk has a strong impact on his physiology, even if he can adapt to it and didn't require other changes. "I could administer him sedatives to ease it, but he will properly recover faster without them." A firm hand landed on Izuku's shoulder. It stayed there until Izuku's shaking eased and his father took away the oxygen mask and pulled him to his feet for long enough to reach a nearby hospital bed with a pile of towels already there. Izuku grabbed one to clean his face. The sticky feeling was disgusting. "How are you feeling?" He had to wait for a moment while Izuku wiped his face. Izuku could barely speak, his breath still heavy. Never doing that again. Gaining quirks that involve physical or physiological changes can be unpleasant, and implanting them artificially like this needs to be done with enough time. "You will not need to endure the same while acquiring quirks with your own," the doctor assured. "How long was I in there?" "Just over 2 days. It is Sunday evening. Will I feel better by the morning?" "Mostly yes," the doctor said. This time Izuku could actually see the doctor. The old man seemed really familiar, but Izuku couldn't place the face. "You survived going to school with brain damage. You will survive this. You can pretend to be sick for a day if you need to." "No," Izuku responded, shaking his head. "We have our history presentation tomorrow." The doctor looked toward father. At least she raised him to be conscientious. That she did. I could already see it in his training. Izuku looked away while wiping himself. He still wasn't used to receiving much praise outside of his mother's. The doctor pulled a tray closer and turned to Izuku. "Don't bother. It won't go away until you get a proper shower. I will take blood samples for a checkup and then you can go." "Do you think it succeeded?" Izuku asked. The doctor looked at him for a moment through his big goggles. He put down his still unopened needle for taking blood and picked up a scalpel, which he held in front of Izuku. "That is up to you to test," the old man said. Izuku took the scalpel and stared at it. His hands started shaking again. "You don't need to try it now, but you should be able to endure much more pain than that," his father said. Izuku gulped. He knew that, and the scalpel would be little compared to some of his training sessions. Cutting himself just went against fundamental human nature. He held open his left hand and brought down the scalpel with the right. He winced as the blade cut skin and drew blood. He cut about a 1 centimeter long cut and stared at it, feeling a little ill. At least he would have stared at it, but after blinking he couldn't find the wound anymore and there was no pain. "Wow," Izuku gasped. "Excellent. Now you can survive actual training, and with the summer vacation you will also have time for much more of it." Izuku's hands weren't shaking anymore, but the cold shiver was almost as bad. Concern for what actual training would mean made him forget any worries about the presentation. He was still feeling like he might vomit if he got up from his seat too quickly. He didn't even scowl at Uehara when he had to stand with her in the front of the class. Uehara started with the basic facts of the era. Of course, she blamed the quirkless majority of the time for everything, depicting spread of quirks as the reason for things getting better. He even briefly imagined reaching to the girl and demonstrating all for one for the presentation, but restrained himself at least that much. The teacher didn't interrupt or even scowl at Uehara's bigotry. Ida, at least, stuck to the script discussing the rise of organized villainy and first points about the Emperor of Villains. Then it was Izuku's turn. Despite being often referred to as such in modern history books when they mention him at all, the sources of the time do not seem to use that name, as it only appears in sources written decades after he rose to power. We also could not find any reliable source about his original name. Most sources from his lifetime seem to refer to this man as All for One. This was the name of his quirk and secret to his power and influence. Izuku explained and tried to stand steady despite a growing nausea he was feeling. Today, with quirks so common, they are widely considered an inherent part of a person, like any organ or thoughts in your head. So most people naturally find this hard to believe. But based on sources from the time, All for One possessed a unique quirk that allowed him to take other people's quirks as well as use and give them away. It is not known if the quirk had any limitations. As expected, the statement caused muttering across the classroom. The teacher seemed thoughtful. Izuku continued explaining how All for One gained power with his quirk, leaving out details he would not have found from their sources and leaving in some falsities that he did. He was still careful to not refer to his father as a villain except in the sense of how modern society described him. As for how his story ends, we don't really know, Izuku lied. There are no reliable records of his death. We have read some stories talking about him being around even in modern times. Some online conspiracy theorists even claim All Might stopped him, but that would make him well over 100 years old. Either way, trying to fit him in the modern hero-villain dichotomy with names like the Emperor of Villains is inaccurate and fails to explain how things were back then and his role in all of it. Looking at him without falling into using our modern standards, it seems he sought change in the society as it was at the time, like many others did, but was over time simply left on the losing side and labeled a villain for opposing what we consider the norms today. Winners write the history after all. That is the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening. He got an applause that seemed more cautious than the previous presentations had received. Izuku glanced at the teacher who scribbled notes and then turned to face them. That was an interesting presentation, especially many of your conclusions went beyond what is generally required. I am curious of what sources were they based on? You especially didn't seem to question the existence of the quirk All for One much, even though its supposed ability runs contrary to our current understanding of quirks. The so-called current understanding of people in this society includes many ideas, especially about quirks, Izuku said and glanced at Uehara. That doesn't make them true. If you look at the actual sources and statements from the time without bias, they are consistent on the basics of his power. The sources are listed in the notes of the slides. I had to go to the National Diet Library for the most important ones. The most surprising part is that he seemingly had massive influence on the country, but almost no one today seems to remember him beyond vague stories of an emperor of villains being a major villain a long time ago. No other history class I have been to has even mentioned him, at least not by name. Did you go all the way to Tokyo to visit the library? The teacher asked. Only Midoriya did. Ida admitted, not knowing how easy travel was by warping. He found most of our material that wasn't online. The teacher nodded and wrote notes. I also liked how you discussed people's different views back then compared to today. Good thing people have learned and evolved since then, Uehara commented. Too bad Midoriya wouldn't properly discuss the flaws of the ideas of people like this All for One. Just because people didn't realize to call him a villain doesn't make him not one. You think that every idea that disagrees with yours is flawed, Midoriya added. And you can't see the reality. Probably because you barely got a quirk and can't properly appreciate it. At least I don't shit on people for how they were born. You are no better than the people that treated first people with quirks like monsters. Midoriya turned to face Uehara. Okay, UTW. The teacher paused mid-sentence as Izuku stumbled and brought his hands to his mouth. He spun towards the door a bit unsteady, but it was already too late. A single gagging noise was the only warning before Izuku's lunch came up and onto the floor. Ha! Uehara laughed even as Izuku rushed to a nearby trash can. Seems you can't stand even your own ideas. Uehara, teacher said, go back to your seat. We will talk after the lesson. Izuku would have been happy to see a teacher doing at least something to her, but that little wasn't exactly enough to distract him from vomiting in front of the whole class. Maybe standing around for a long presentation hadn't been the best idea the day after finishing a quirk implantation. The regeneration quirk was really exacting a price for its power. It was still worth it though, as proven by his shattered arm the next time he trained, when his father let the Nomu fight more seriously. At least the creature stopped when Izuku told it to. His father came to kneel next to Izuku. Izuku yelped and bit his teeth together at the pain of burns and broken bones and the reformation of those bones as his body healed from the damage. Thankfully, the quirk worked rapidly. He could see his arm twisting back to its normal direction at a visible speed, and soon the pain too started disappearing. Not long after the injury was gone, and the only sign of it ever existing was Izuku's heavy breathing that took a while longer to calm down. He raised the formerly broken arm, flexing and turning it. The only pain he felt was in his head from adapting to the powerful quirk. He got up to face his father. "Do you understand now the reason I have pushed you so hard? Imagine if a hero or villain did that to you. Even with the regeneration, you were completely incapacitated and vulnerable. As powerful as this quirk is, it does not make you immortal. And it still hurts," Izuku said and looked at his healed arm. He barely noticed his father's arm moving just in time to lean away from an air cannon blast. "Then train until no one can hurt you. I am an elderly man stuck to a breathing machine and still need to hold back." "An elderly man with hundreds of quirks," Izuku pouted. "Actually only 94, father responded. "I used to have more, but even for me it was quite a mental strain at the peak of the number of quirks. After my injuries it became too much. In a single day my near unlimited potential was diminished to a fraction of what it used to be, so I shed some and decided to be more selective. I think my limit now is around 100 depending on the quirk, and the doctor worries even that will yet decline. I have already noticed greater strain in using my quirks." Izuku stared at his father for a long moment, uncertain how to respond. "You still have the potential I lost. You only need to work to build on it." So, father stepped away. Nomu 2, destroy. One of the Nomus waiting at the edges of the room charged forward, reaching to grab Izuku, who jumped out of the way. A long and thin blade of flames appeared behind his right hand as he activated the dragon blade and vibration. A rapid swing cut the Nomu's hand off. That much he had managed before, but the other hand was coming in for a punch. Even as he had swung with one blade, he was forcing the other to gather and thicken against the back of his other hand. Manipulating the shape of the fire he could use, it was a small shield instead of a blade, but if he was too slow again, or the shield was too thin again, he would need to rebuild an arm again. The fiery shield hummed from its rapid vibrations until the noise was covered under a loud thump. Izuku flew backwards, feeling his bones creaking as they barely held together. He stumbled as his feet touched the ground a fraction of a second later, but this time he remained on his feet. The Nomu continued its assault, charging forward with its cut and singed arms spread wide. After enduring a shattered arm, that was one bear hug Izuku did not want to experience, unless the creature was planning to tear him in two. Izuku's first instinct was to scream and run. His father's training was to attack. With adrenaline running through his veins, Izuku charged forward, ducked under the Nomu's arms, and shoved his right hand upwards. Hot droplets fell on Izuku, making him to jump away just in time to avoid being trapped under the falling body. He crouched to stare at the Nomu, the dead Nomu, with its exposed brain split in two and not healing. "Excellent," his father said. "Your first clear victory, and you didn't even need the regeneration. I didn't mean to kill it. My body just moved before I had time to think." That means you are developing proper fighting instincts. Your analytical abilities are impressive, but sometimes you must be able to just move, unless you find a quirk that increases the speed of thought, he declared, wailing close enough to ruffle Izuku's hair as he spoke in a softer, warmer tone. "I know it is a bit shocking to you. With Kurogiri around, it is difficult for you to accept this Nomu was just a brainless creature, but you still did good. In fact, I have a gift for you. Nomu 1, bring the suitcase." The Nomu that had broken Izuku's arm before took a large black briefcase and brought it to the father and son. The father took it and held it open in front of Izuku. Izuku simply stared at the contents for a moment until he reached in and took out a black face mask reminiscent of the lower half of his father's helmet. It wasn't as thick and wouldn't have covered its user's neck, but the front had a thicker shield-like part than his father's. It didn't have pipes coming from it, but the black metal had silvery horizontal lines that mimicked their look. Is this? Heroes have their unique costumes to help in creating their public image. Many villains have them as well, but primarily to hide their identity, he said. You told Tamura you want to change the society instead of just complaining about it, something I have been waiting to hear. If you are going to be involved with anything without abandoning your normal life, you need a costume and a new identity. Go take a shower and try it on while I clean up this mess. Izuku took the suitcase in silence. He wasn't even sure what to think about this gift. He was grateful, but it felt like he was being pushed ahead faster than he was prepared for. He took off his shirt stained in Nomu blood and took a long shower to wash the rest off himself. As he was drying with a towel, he stopped in front of the bathroom mirror to see if he had washed off everything. He stopped to stare at his reflection and wonder who was the person looking back. Some of the depressed tiredness he accumulated over the years was gone from his face, and his reflection looked older than he remembered, both his face and body, and the later was really starting to show the results of his training. His endurance was never bad, but in the past no muscles had been actually visible. Now he was at least as fit as Bakugo. Just thinking the name made his expression darken, and he went back to the briefcase. He was suspicious of what his father and especially Tamura planned, but someone had to stand up against the Bakugos of the world. Izuku changed into the new villain costume. Similarities with his father's usual dress were obvious, but instead of a regular black suit, Izuku's costume was more akin to a formal military uniform with a solid black jacket and pants and, luckily, no tie. It actually reminded Izuku of his former black school uniform, which was the biggest problem that he had with the clothes. They were more comfortable than they seemed and didn't feel like they hindered his movements. There were two exceptions to the simplistic formal look. It came with quite tall and heavy-duty metal-reinforced combat boots and gloves which also had metal at the back of his hands, fingers pieces like brass knuckles, and most likely fire protection for his quirk. Izuku would have preferred red boots, though. It took him a moment to figure out how the helmet worked. Besides the collar, it had a thinner top half, which the front side of folded inside the sturdier backside. The lack of clear eye holes worried Izuku a bit since, unlike his father, he still had his eyes. But from the inside, he could actually see just as well as with no mask at all, despite how the outside appeared. The one-way lenses even had a heads-up display. "Cool," he said, surprising himself with the distorted and low voice that came out of the integrated voice changer. Somehow the lower part of the helmet seemed to fit it, a communication device, a microphone, and what appeared to be filters for a gas mask. He returned to his father. All of the low-tier nomus were gone, and there wasn't as much as a blood stain left of the dead one. It was just his father, Kirojiri, and surprisingly Tamura. "Hello, brother," greeted Tamura. The young man looked at him for a moment and muttered, "Literally a mini-boss. Looks good, just as I expected. How does it feel?" His father asked. "Great, like it was custom-tailored for me," Izuku responded. "That is because it was. But I never got measurements taken. I had to replace my eyes with quirks. In some ways, they are better than normal vision. Acquiring precise measurements was no problem. I even observed how you typically move. The costume was made to work as a formal wear inspired by military uniforms to look representative, while still being simple and practical in battle. The material is fire and stab resistant, but you will need something heavier if you plan to get shot. Not that getting shot would kill you anymore." "Formal," Izuku muttered. "When you first introduced me and Tamura, you said something about being a representative?" "Yes. All Might may have decimated my previous empire, but many separate operations still remain, mostly information gathering, secret research, and agents running my legal cover businesses. Things that cannot easily be stopped by punching. For years, I have kept them under control from a distance, but sometimes a more direct contact is beneficial. Kirojiri can do only so much while Tamura and the doctor are busy with other matters. So, you want me to be your messenger? Depending on your choices, you can become much more, but let's start with something less dangerous at least until you are equipped with more powerful quirks, in case you need to fight during such a mission." "What do you mean?" Izuku asked and activated his dragon blade. "Both your blade and All for One are already known to others. At the moment, you can only rely on the regeneration and vibration quirks while wearing that suit, unless you are prepared to eliminate any and all witnesses." "Dad," Izuku said, walking closer to his father, "there was a time I wanted to be a pro hero without a quirk, and if I practice with the vibration enough, I think it can be almost as powerful as Tamura's quirk and even more useful, if I can control it enough to not give people brain damage." Tamura huffed at the mention of his name and walked away. All for One looked thoughtful. I did not intend to understate your abilities, but can you blame me? Parents worry. Skill or quirks, I will make sure you will be strong enough that danger fears you. Starting tomorrow, we'll focus your training on using the vibration quirk alone. Until then, I think you need a practice mission. You think I am ready? Maybe not yet. This time you will be accompanying Tamura on one of his meetings. Get a feel of things in the shadows of the society. Tamura, he is all yours for the rest of the evening. Try to bring both of you back in one piece, without need for regeneration. Great, an escort mission. I hate those, Tamura muttered. Kurogiri, make us a gate. We'll see how. He paused and looked at Izuku, a strange look in his eyes. What? Izuku asked. What are we going to call you there? Oh, right, I can't let people hear my name. I need a code name if I'm going to do things like this. What do you use? Tamura Shigaraki, Tamura responded, annoyed. Your normal name? This is the only name and only life I have. I don't need to bother with any other shit. Then you could call me Shigaraki too, Izuku said, at least until I can think of an alternative name. We are brothers after all. Tamura stared at him for a moment and turned around. Fine, just don't get into my way.
Kurogiri, gotte.
Izuku's favorite Nomu did as told, and a wall of mist rose in front of the two brothers. The darkness of the mist was replaced with an alley that wasn't much brighter. So where are we going? To meet a small gang and recruit them for the league. I am no messenger. Sensei trusts me to create and lead the league to support our goals. I will build an entire army for him and destroy the so-called symbol of peace. Build an army. We are recruiting soldiers. Got it. Here, Tamura said and pointed at a worn-out back door. Izuku reached out to knock. Stop, you fool. You are going to reveal we are coming. Aren't they waiting for us? I thought you have arranged a meeting with them. I am arranging a meeting with them now, Tamura said. Have to show NPCs their place and what I can do right from the beginning. In the underworld, strength matters more than being nice. Now get out of my way. Tamura reached for the door clearly to turn the whole thing to dust. Wait, that might attract attention. I got an idea, Izuku said and pressed his fingers against the lock. It began shaking as he activated his vibration quirk and sped up the vibrations until there was a metallic crack. Izuku poked the door, and it opened without resistance. He stepped aside and looked at Tamura, who was scowling behind his face hand. After you. Remember, I am in charge. And try not to look too weak, Tamura said as they walked to a small room and headed down a narrow spiral staircase. I will follow your lead. You have more experience in this. Yes, I do. The stairs creaked as they stepped on them, but as they descended, that was covered under the sound of music coming from behind a door at the bottom of the staircase. When they got closer, Izuku could also distinguish happy chatter. Tamura stopped and raised his hand with one finger up. This one is mine. He slammed his hand and all 5 fingers against the door. Both already worn-out paint and exposed wood quickly turned gray and began shattering into dust. The chatter behind the door ended. Finally, whatever was holding it together failed and a cloud of dust fell on the ground. Behind it was a living room or lounge-type room with worn-out furniture and a shelf full of alcohol. Half a dozen people were standing facing towards the former door. Most of them had mutant-type quirks with all kinds of appearance-altering mutations, many on the more visible end of the spectrum. Izuku couldn't help but wonder if discrimination for those quirks had led them to this place. One of them, for example, had 4 arms and strange light blue skin with a lot of sharp edges, like some kind of rock. Another had 4 legs, each in 90-degree angles from each other. The most normal-looking person was wearing a skull-like helmet and small lightings sparked between his fingers, an electric-type quirk. Izuku was worried if the man could use the lightning from a distance. Mind if we come in? Tamura said and stepped over the pile of dust he had created. Not if you don't mind dying, the 4-armed blue man said and charged at Tamura. Izuku crouched into fighting position, but Tamura was faster. Tamura evaded the larger man's attack, tripped him and elbowed his back in rapid attack that slammed the man onto the ground. Without his father's harsh training, Izuku couldn't have even followed Tamura's moves properly. Tamura put all but one finger on the man's head. "If I touch him with the fifth finger, he will share the fate of your door," Tamura threatened. "I have come to talk, not fight. Stand down or die." Izuku wanted to comment on the hypocrisy in Tamura's statements, but he didn't want to upset the already dangerous situation. He tensed suddenly. Something nearly imperceptible moved at the edge of his vision. A step sounded against the floor. The attacker was fast, but not as fast as Izuku's father's air blasts. Izuku leaned out of the way of the near-invisible attacker and slammed his fist at the back of the attacker's head. The chameleon-looking villain became visible again, groaning against the floor. In a split-second decision, Izuku mimicked Tamura, holding his hand against the chameleon villain's head despite the dark memories that the action threatened to bring up. "Stay down," he said, his voice made more threatening by the helmet's voice changer. "My quirk can be just as deadly as my brother's." "Who are you?" the electric man shouted. Izuku glanced at Tamura. "I am Tamura Shigaraki, the leader of the League of Villains, and I have come to offer you an opportunity for something more than this." Tamura gestured at the shady room. Compared to it, the League's bar was a high-end establishment. "And who is your brother?" the same electric man asked. Tamura growled at the question. "He is observing." "So, the mighty leader of the League of Villains needs a babysitter." "Actually, I am here to learn from him," Izuku said, worried at what the seething Tamura might do. He took his hand away from the chameleon-like man and nudged him to get up and join his friends. "You can free the other if you listen." "Fine, we'll listen. But that doesn't mean you get to leave alive if we don't like what we hear." "You talk big, but do you have the guts to live up to your words? So far you have committed random street crime and killed small-time thugs. I am offering you an opportunity to go after much bigger prey, to tear down the society that has oppressed you for how you were born. I will turn it to dust." Following his declaration, Tamura remained quiet, his eyes locked on the man in front of him, waiting for a response. "So, you are going to destroy society?" the electric man chuckled. "Even if we assumed you could do that, what then? What will you do when there is nothing left?" Izuku could see Tamura's finger twitching, the only one that was needed to disintegrate the man under him. The group in front of them seemed similarly tense. Izuku wasn't yet sure about Tamura's full capabilities, but they were outnumbered. He didn't share Tamura's apparent confidence facing those odds. Not to mention Tamura's trouble answering that particular question when Izuku had asked it. He gulped, grateful that his face was completely covered. "Destroying the current society doesn't mean there is nothing left," he said. Tamura turned to give him an angry stare, but it was too late to hold back. Tamura himself had told him to show strength. Everyone here should know the wrongs perpetuated by this society. I am sure all of us have experienced them in some fashion, whether it's discrimination by how we were born or being failed by those so-called heroes who the society has made itself dependent on by suppressing everyone else and any change that might threaten their power. For anything to change those systems, and people's belief in them must be destroyed, especially people's false confidence in the heroes. And that is going to benefit us how? As long as a small minority dominated by people with specific types of quirks is allowed to dictate what people consider right or wrong, everyone outside that ideal are doomed to live as second-rate citizens. Without people's support, it will be much harder for heroes to hold on to that power. Can't argue with that. At least you have a vision. It doesn't mean you can make it reality. How would you destroy people's faith in heroes? By destroying their symbol of peace, Tamura said, hiding most of the anger he certainly felt. The electric man whistled. "Ambitious, I tell you to go to hell with that delusion." But he, the man pointed at Izuku, sounded like you have an actual plan. "Personally, I am interested in seeing where this league goes. Now if you would let our friend go." A while later, Izuku followed Tamura back up the stairs in silence. It was hard to tell Tamura's real feelings. Despite his usual behavior, he had actually kept cool in the meeting. They stepped back to the dark alley. Izuku saw the approaching hand just in time and jumped aside before Tamura could grab him. After failing at that, Tamura started scratching his neck. "You bastard. What did I tell you when we came here?" Tamura seethed. Don't be weak." "No, I am in charge. You were supposed to shut up and stay out of the way. I was going to, but you still haven't figured your answer to that question. Dad would have been disappointed if the mission failed. You can take the whole credit if you want to. I don't care about the credit. The league is mine. Help Sensei however you can, but stay out of my way. Okay. I'm not interested in the league. I just want to do best for our family. Tamura stared at him for a moment, turned away, and pulled his phone to call Kurojiri. Just stay on your own boss level.